Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was driving alone on a long stretch of highway, the kind where you don't see another car for miles. The trip was supposed to be a straight shot, but I'd left later than I planned and ended up driving through the night. I didn't mind at first. It was quiet, peaceful even. But as the hours dragged on, my eyelids got heavier, and I knew I needed a break. It was close to midnight when I saw the lights of a diner ahead. There wasn't much else around, just empty road and darkness, so the glowing sign felt like a relief. Darlene's Diner, it said. It looked like the kind of place that probably hadn't changed in decades. Old neon sign, a row of booths along the windows, and a counter with swivel stools. I pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching under my tires, and parked near the entrance. Inside, the place was mostly empty, except for a few people scattered at the tables. The bell above the door jingled as I walked in, and a woman behind the counter immediately smiled at me. Too wide, like she'd been waiting for me. "Evening, hon," she said, her voice sugary sweet. "Just you tonight?" I nodded and took a seat at one of the booths by the window. It was quieter in there than I expected. The kind of quiet that makes your ears ring. The air felt heavy, like the whole place was holding its breath. The woman behind the counter, Darlene, I guess from the sign, came over with a menu, but I didn't need to look at it. I just wanted coffee, something to keep me awake. "Just coffee, please," I said. She gave me another too-wide smile and headed back behind the counter. I glanced around, feeling uneasy for reasons I couldn't quite explain. There were maybe 4 other people in the diner, all sitting at different tables. None of them were eating. In fact, they weren't doing anything at all. Just sitting there, staring ahead, their eyes blank. I tried not to make eye contact with them, but it was hard not to notice. One man sat in a booth across from me, his hands resting on the table, completely still. His eyes didn't move, didn't blink. He was staring directly at me. I shifted in my seat, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Darlene came back with my coffee, setting it down in front of me with a soft clink. I tried to give her a polite smile, but it felt forced. The whole place was off, like stepping into a dream where nothing quite makes sense. "Where are you headed?" Darlene asked, lingering by my table. "Just passing through," I said, taking a sip of the coffee. It was bitter and lukewarm, but I didn't care. I just wanted to leave. She nodded slowly, like she knew more than she was letting on. Not many folks come through here this time of night. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and glanced out the window, hoping the conversation would end. The diner's parking lot was empty except for my car, and beyond that was just darkness. No other buildings, no streetlights. Just the road disappearing into the black. I started to feel trapped, like the walls were closing in on me. The silence in the diner was deafening now, the air heavy with something I couldn't name. I glanced back at the other customers, and my stomach turned when I realized they were all looking at me. Every single one of them. Their faces were blank, but their eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. I looked down at my coffee, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I was just tired, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But when I looked up again, they were still staring. "Everything all right, hon?" Darlene's voice made me jump. She was standing behind the counter, her hands resting on it as she watched me closely. Too closely. "I'm fine," I said, my voice a little shaky. "I think I'll get the check." Her smile didn't falter, but something changed in her eyes. She didn't move. You sure you don't want anything to eat? We make a great pie. No, I'm good, really, I said, standing up quickly. I grabbed my jacket, ready to leave. But when I turned toward the door, my heart stopped. The door was locked. I hadn't noticed it when I came in, but now there was a heavy chain looped through the handles, secured with a padlock. I turned back to Darlene, my mouth dry. Why is the door locked? She didn't answer right away, just kept smiling at me like nothing was wrong. Oh, don't worry about that. It's for your own safety. Lots of strange folks out on the road at night. I took a step back, my pulse racing. I think I'd like to go now. Darlene tilted her head, her smile never leaving her face. You haven't finished your coffee. I looked around, desperate for a way out. The other customers hadn't moved, still sitting there like mannequins, their eyes locked on me. My hands were shaking, but I tried to keep my voice steady. Unlock the door. Darlene didn't move. Instead, she walked over to the counter, her heels clicking on the tile, and picked up a phone. She held it in her hand, watching me. I'll just give our friend a call. He'll want to know you're here. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I bolted for the back of the diner, hoping there was another exit. My heart was pounding in my chest, my mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be. I ran past the kitchen, the smell of grease and old food hanging in the air, and pushed open a door that led to a narrow hallway. At the end of it, I saw a door marked exit. I nearly cried with relief as I sprinted toward it. But when I reached it and pushed on the handle, it didn't budge. The door was locked, just like the front. Panic set in, real and sharp. I pounded on the door, hoping maybe someone outside could hear me, but I knew it was pointless. There was no one around for miles. I turned around, my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming down the hallway. It was one of the men from the diner, the one who had been sitting closest to me. He was walking toward me, his face blank, his eyes fixed on mine. Darlene says you should come back, he said, his voice flat, emotionless. I backed away, my hands fumbling for something, anything to defend myself with. But there was nothing. Just a dead end and a locked door. He kept coming, his eyes never leaving mine. I didn't know what he was going to do, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. I ran past him, back into the diner, hoping maybe I could smash a window or find something heavy to break the lock on the door. But when I got back to the front, Darlene was waiting for me, her smile gone now, replaced with something colder, darker. She was holding a set of keys in her hand, dangling them in front of her like bait. You're not leaving until he gets here, she said, her voice low. You might as well sit down. I felt the room spinning, my vision narrowing. Who was he? What did they want with me? I didn't care. I just wanted out. Without thinking, I grabbed a chair and swung it at the window, shattering the glass. The sound was deafening, but I didn't stop to look back. I climbed through the broken window, cutting my hands on the shards, and ran to my car. The gravel crunched under my feet as I fumbled for my keys, my hands slick with blood and sweat. I jumped into the car, started the engine, and peeled out of the lot, not daring to look back. As I sped down the highway, the diner's lights disappeared into the distance, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. I had always liked small-town fairs. There's something about the smell of fried food, the bright lights, and the noise of the crowds that makes you feel like a kid again. This year, I was traveling for work, and I found myself in one of those towns that barely shows up on a map. It just so happened they were having their annual fair, and since I didn't have much else to do, I decided to check it out. The fairgrounds were on the edge of town, a big open field with a few rides, game booths, and a stage where a local band was playing. It wasn't as flashy as the big city fairs, but it had its own charm. There were families with kids running around, couples holding hands, and groups of teenagers laughing and shoving each other near the bumper cars. I bought a ticket at the gate and wandered in, figuring I'd grab something to eat and maybe try a few games. As I walked past a booth where a man was calling out for people to win a stuffed bear, I noticed him. A man standing off to the side, just outside the main crowd. He wasn't doing anything, just watching. His face was pale, almost sickly, and he wore a long coat that seemed too heavy for the warm night. His eyes were fixed on me. It was the kind of stare that makes you uncomfortable, like he knew something about me that I didn't. I shrugged it off, telling myself he was probably just some guy zoning out, and went to get a corn dog. I spent the next hour or so wandering around the fair, trying out some of the games and watching the rides. I even went on the Ferris wheel, which gave me a good view of the whole place. It was nice, peaceful even. But every now and then, I caught sight of that man again. He wasn't close, but he was there. Always just far enough away that I couldn't really make out his face, but I knew it was him. The coat, the way he stood, arms hanging at his sides. Watching. It started to get to me after a while. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. I told myself it was just paranoia, that it was a small fair and it made sense to see the same people more than once. But as the night went on, it got harder to ignore. Every time I turned around, he was there. Not saying anything, not getting closer. Just standing still, staring. I tried to lose myself in the crowd, moving between rides and booths, but no matter where I went, he was there. I tried going into the funhouse, figuring the mirrors and dark corners would throw him off, but when I came out, he was waiting near the exit, standing next to a group of teenagers who seemed completely unaware of him. I started to get this tight feeling in my chest, like the walls were closing in. It wasn't crowded anymore. Families were heading home, and the groups of teenagers had thinned out. The fair was winding down, and most people were near the stage, watching the band. The farther I got from the main area, the quieter it got, until it was just me and the hum of the rides in the distance. That's when I saw him again, only this time, he wasn't just watching. He was moving toward me. I stopped walking, my heart pounding. He was coming straight for me, his hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. His face was still hard to make out in the dim light, but I could see enough. His eyes were locked on me, his mouth set in a grim line. I turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction, trying to keep my pace steady. I didn't want to run, not yet, not until I was sure. But I could hear him behind me, his footsteps crunching in the dirt, getting faster. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I knew. He was running. I broke into a sprint, dodging between the booths and trying to head back toward the entrance. But the lights from the fair seemed farther away now, like the whole place had shifted while I wasn't looking. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were moving through water. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. I turned a corner and found myself in a part of the fairground that hadn't been set up with booths or rides. It was just empty space, dark and quiet. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and I slowed down, trying to listen. I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, but I knew he was close. I looked around, trying to find a way out, but there was nothing. Just shadows and silence. Then I heard it, soft at first, like the wind moving through the grass. But it wasn't the wind. It was his voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The words were low, almost a whisper, but they sent a chill down my spine. I didn't know where he was, but he was close. too close. I started backing up, my eyes scanning the darkness, trying to find him. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. He was standing just a few feet away, half hidden in the shadows. His face was twisted in a sneer, and his eyes were wild. "I just want to go," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't want any trouble." He didn't answer, just took a step toward me. I stumbled back, my hands shaking, and nearly fell. I had to get out of there, but every direction I looked seemed like a dead end. The fair was just a distant blur of lights now, too far away. He took another step, then another. His hands came out of his pockets, and I saw the glint of something metal in the dim light. A knife. I didn't think. I just ran. I don't know how long I ran for, but it felt like hours. My legs were burning, my lungs felt like they were going to burst, but I kept going. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding the ground, getting closer. I rounded a corner and saw the lights of the fair again, the sound of the band echoing in the distance. I wasn't far now, but my legs felt like lead. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain, ignoring the fear. I had to make it. I burst out of the dark, back into the main area of the fair. There were still people around, still enough light and noise to make me feel like I had a chance. I kept running, not stopping until I reached the entrance. The ticket booth was empty now, and the gates were wide open. I didn't look back. I didn't want to know if he was still behind me. I got to my car, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the keys out of my pocket. I fumbled with the lock, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, half expecting him to appear out of the darkness. But he didn't. I got in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the lights of the fair lawn behind me. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just some local who didn't like outsiders, or maybe he was something worse. But I didn't care. I was safe now, and that was all that mattered. But I'll never forget the look in his eyes, or the way he whispered those words, like he was daring me to run. Like he knew I wouldn't make it out. I was driving through this stretch of nowhere when I realized I wouldn't make it to the next town before dark. I had been on the road for hours, and everything around me was just open highway and fields. I spotted a sign for a motel up ahead, just before the sun dipped below the horizon. It wasn't like I had many options, so I took the exit and followed the road for a mile or so before I saw it, this old, beat-up place that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation in decades. The sign buzzed, flickering a weak neon vacancy. The parking lot was mostly empty except for 2 cars parked near the office. One of the headlights from one of the cars was cracked, hanging loosely, like someone had backed into something but never bothered to fix it. I parked and walked into the front office, which smelled like stale cigarettes and cleaning chemicals. There was an old man behind the counter, eyes glued to a tiny TV with the volume turned too low to hear. I rang the bell, and he looked up slowly, like I had interrupted something important. "Need a room?" he asked, his voice rough, like he didn't talk to people much. "Yeah," I said, hoping I didn't sound too uncomfortable. I just wanted a place to crash for the night. One night. He didn't say anything after that, just took my cash and handed me a key. The key wasn't even one of those modern key cards, but an actual metal key attached to a worn leather tag with the number 5 stamped on it. "Room's around the corner," he said, already looking back at his TV. "Checkout's at 10. I nodded and left the office, walking across the parking lot to room 5. The motel was a single-story building, maybe 10 rooms in total. The place was quiet, but there was something about it that just felt off. The walls looked like they'd been patched up 100 times, and the paint was peeling around the door frames. It felt like one of those places where people just disappeared, and no one noticed. I unlocked the door to my room and stepped inside. It smelled like old carpet and mildew, but I wasn't expecting much from a place like this. The bed was an old double, the kind that creaked when you sat on it. There was a small TV on a dresser, a couple of lamps, and a bathroom in the back. It wasn't clean, but it wasn't filthy either. Just run down. I dropped my bag by the door and sat on the bed, trying to shake off the unease that had crept up on me since I pulled into the parking lot. I told myself it was just because I was tired. It wasn't like I hadn't stayed in worse places before. After a few minutes, I decided to take a quick shower. The water pressure was terrible, and the hot water ran out after a few minutes, so I didn't stay in long. When I came back out, I thought I heard something, a faint thud coming from the room next door. I paused, listening. It was quiet again, so I figured it was just the walls being thin. I turned on the TV, trying to find something to watch, but the static on half the channels made it clear that I wouldn't be getting much entertainment from it. Eventually, I settled on some old black and white movie that was barely audible over the buzzing of the old TV. It was around midnight when I started hearing the noises again. At first, it was soft, like someone moving around in the room next door. But then it got louder. There was a scraping sound, like furniture being dragged across the floor, followed by a series of loud thuds. I turned off the TV and listened, feeling that same unease creeping back. I tried to ignore it at first, telling myself it was just the old building settling or maybe someone moving around. But the noises kept going, and they started to sound wrong. Like someone was trying to be quiet but wasn't doing a good job of it. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl, a faint, muffled voice. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it was coming from the room next door. I told myself to mind my own business, that it wasn't anything to worry about, but something about it felt off. It wasn't like an argument or anything like that. It was more like someone was whispering to themselves. I couldn't help it. I got up and went to the window, pulling the curtain back just a little to see if I could spot anything outside. The parking lot was mostly empty, just my car and the two others I had seen when I pulled in. Everything else was quiet. Too quiet. I went to the door, pressing my ear against it, listening. The noises from next door had stopped, but now there was something else. It was faint, but I could hear it like a soft humming, coming from somewhere inside my room. I turned, looking around. The hum was coming from near the dresser, but there was nothing there. I crouched down, listening closely, and that's when I saw it just under the edge of the dresser, partially hidden by the wood. A small hole, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I leaned closer, and that's when I saw the tiny lens. A camera. My heart stopped. There was a camera hidden in my room, aimed directly at the bed. I felt sick. I backed away quickly, my pulse racing. Someone had been watching me this whole time. I couldn't believe it. I didn't know what to do. Should I leave? Should I confront the guy at the front desk? But then I thought about the noises I had heard. What if it wasn't just me? What if the person in the room next door had been caught too? I needed to find out. I grabbed my phone, turning on the flashlight, and crept out into the hallway. The door to the room next to mine was slightly ajar. I could feel the tension in the air, like something was about to snap. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the door, pushing it open just enough to peek inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The room was a mess. Furniture was overturned, the bed sheets torn off, and in the middle of the floor, there was a camera on a tripod, facing the bed. But there was no one there. The room was empty, but it felt like someone had just been there, like they had left in a hurry. I turned to leave, my heart pounding in my chest, but as I stepped back into the hallway, I heard the faint creak of footsteps behind me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Someone was there. I turned slowly, and that's when I saw him. The old man from the front desk, standing at the end of the hall, staring at me with cold, dead eyes. He didn't say anything, just stood there, watching me like he had been waiting for this moment. My mind raced. I didn't know what to do. My first instinct was to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. He took a step toward me, and that was enough to snap me out of it. I bolted for my room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I grabbed my bag, fumbling with the zipper as I tried to pack up my things as quickly as I could. I wasn't staying here another second. I threw on my shoes and rushed to the door, my heart racing. But when I reached for the handle, I heard it again, the soft humming, coming from somewhere inside the room. I froze, my hand hovering over the door. Slowly, I turned around, and that's when I saw it. Another camera, hidden in the vent above the bed. I felt like I was going to be sick. I was trapped. Whoever was watching me wasn't just in the next room, they were everywhere. I didn't wait to find out what was going to happen next. I yanked the door open and ran. I didn't look back, not even when I heard the door to the room next to mine creak open behind me. I ran to my car, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. But I did. I started the car and sped out of the parking lot, the tires screeching on the pavement. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, far away from that place. I don't know what was going on in that motel, and I don't want to know. But I'll never forget the way that man looked at me, or the feeling of being watched. I've stayed in plenty of motels before, but after that night, I don't think I'll ever feel safe in one again. I didn't want to stop, not at first. I was passing through this small town, just trying to get back home. I had a project I wanted to get started on before the weekend was over, replacing some old flooring in the guest room, and I was missing a few things. Nails, some wood glue, and a new utility knife. Simple stuff. But when I saw the hardware store sign off the main road, I figured it wouldn't hurt to stop. The place didn't look like much, just a small, rundown building with a weathered sign that said Smith's Hardware in faded letters. There were a few pickup trucks parked outside, and one of those plastic open signs hanging crooked in the window. I parked my car and went inside, figuring I'd be in and out in a few minutes. The moment I walked in, I noticed how quiet it was. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only person in the world. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside, and I glanced around. The shelves were packed tight with tools, screws, and all sorts of stuff, but everything felt off. The lights were dim, and there was this faint smell, like old wood and something metallic. There was a man behind the counter, maybe in his late 50s. He had thinning hair and wore a stained apron that looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. His eyes snapped up as soon as I walked in, like he had been waiting for me. He didn't say anything right away, just watched me as I wandered down one of the aisles. I tried to shake off the weird feeling. I found what I needed pretty quickly, a pack of nails, some wood glue, and a decent-looking utility knife, and headed toward the register. As I approached the counter, the man finally spoke. "You working on something?" His voice was raspy, like he'd been smoking too much, but there was something in his tone that rubbed me the wrong way. Too eager, maybe. "Yeah," I said, setting the items down. "Just replacing some flooring at home." He nodded slowly, like he was considering something. "That old knife you got there, it won't last long. You're better off with a heavier one, something that'll cut through the tougher stuff. I glanced at the knife. It looked fine to me. This should work for what I need. He stared at me for a second too long, then gave a slow smile. Well, suit yourself. Just don't come back complaining when it breaks on you. I didn't respond, just waited while he rang up my things. I could feel his eyes on me the whole time, like he was sizing me up, like he knew something I didn't. It made my skin crawl. That'll be $22.50, he said, finally looking away. I handed him the cash, and as he gave me my change, he spoke again. You doing the work yourself? He asked. Yeah, I said, keeping my answer short. I didn't feel like getting into a conversation with this guy. He nodded again, like he approved. I could come by, give you a hand if you need it. I laughed, thinking he was just making small talk. No, thanks. I've got it covered. But he didn't laugh. His smile stayed, but it was wrong, like it didn't belong on his face. No trouble at all. I know my way around this kind of stuff. Been doing it for years. You'd be surprised how many folks think they can handle it, but it turns out they can't. I could save you some time. I shook my head, trying to be polite but firm. Really, I'm fine. I'm just doing a small job. He didn't seem to hear me. Where's your place? Just outside of town? I could swing by tonight, get it done quicker. That's when I started to feel really uneasy. He wasn't just being friendly. There was something else going on here, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. His insistence, the way he kept leaning forward, as if he was trying to pull me into something. I appreciate the offer, I said, taking a step back from the counter, but I'm good. I grabbed my bag of supplies and started to head for the door. But just as I reached it, I heard him call after me. You sure? I'm happy to help. I could follow you back right now. I turned, my hand on the doorknob, and gave him a final look. I'm sure. Thanks anyway. I didn't wait for him to respond. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the fading daylight. As I walked to my car, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting him to be standing in the doorway, watching me. But the door was closed, and the parking lot was empty, save for the 2 trucks. I got into my car, tossed the bag onto the passenger seat, and started the engine. I couldn't shake the weird feeling in my gut. It wasn't just that the guy was being pushy. There was something more to it, like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for me to slip up somehow. I pulled out of the lot and got back on the main road, heading toward home. I tried to put the whole thing out of my mind. It was just a weird interaction. Small towns were full of weird people, right? But as I drove, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those trucks following me. And then I did. At first, I thought it was just a coincidence. There were plenty of trucks in this part of the country. But as I kept driving, I noticed it stayed with me, hanging back just far enough to not seem obvious, but never too far behind. My chest tightened, and I felt my palms start to sweat. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just someone heading in the same direction. But I didn't like it. Not one bit. I decided to test it. I turned off onto a side road that I knew led to a dead end. If the truck followed me down there, then I'd know for sure. Sure enough, it did. I felt a cold knot in my stomach as I watched the truck in the mirror. It was the same one I'd seen parked outside the hardware store. There was no mistaking it. I kept driving down the narrow road, trying to stay calm. I told myself that I just needed to get to the end, turn around, and drive past him. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd just keep going. But as I approached the dead end, the truck sped up, closing the distance between us. My heart was racing now. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but I wasn't going to find out by sticking around. I pulled to the side of the road and threw the car into reverse, my hands shaking as I backed up as fast as I could. The truck kept coming, getting closer and closer until it was just a few feet away. I floored the gas, spinning the car around and speeding back toward the main road. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was following me again. I just kept driving, my knuckles white as I gripped the steering wheel. Eventually, I made it back to the highway. I didn't stop until I was miles away from that town, my heart still pounding in my chest. I don't know what that guy wanted, or why he was so insistent on following me home. But I'm glad I didn't find out. Something about the way he looked at me, the way he spoke, it felt like he had other plans. I never took that exit again, and I never went back to that hardware store. And now, whenever I need supplies for a project, I make sure to stop at a big chain store, somewhere crowded, somewhere safe. I was driving back home after visiting my parents. It wasn't supposed to take that long, but I'd underestimated how much gas I had left. I wasn't anywhere near a highway, just driving through a bunch of back roads, and when I saw that gas light flicker on, I knew I'd better stop somewhere before I ended up stranded. I'd passed a few small towns along the way, so I figured I'd find something soon. Sure enough, about 5 minutes later, I saw a small gas station up ahead. It wasn't much, just 2 pumps in a tiny building with a flickering neon sign that said open. The place looked old, run down, but I didn't have a choice. I pulled in, parked next to one of the pumps, and got out of the car. There was no one else around. The air was still, and the place seemed too quiet for a gas station. I filled up my tank as quickly as I could, keeping an eye on the dark windows of the little building. I didn't like it there. I don't know why, but the whole place made me feel off. When I finished, I realized I needed to go inside to pay. There was no card reader at the pump. Just my luck. I took a deep breath and walked toward the building. The glass door squeaked as I pulled it open, and I stepped inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell, like old cigarettes and something else, something metallic. The second thing was the guy behind the counter. He was staring at me before I even made it all the way in. He was tall, with greasy hair and a yellowing t-shirt that clung to him like it hadn't been washed in days. His eyes were too wide, like he didn't blink enough. He didn't say anything as I walked up to the counter, just watched me the whole way. "I'm just paying for the gas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, but he didn't take his eyes off me. "Where are you headed?" His voice was low, rough, like he smoked a pack a day. I didn't want to get into a conversation. "Just driving home." "Long drive, huh?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Not a lot of people come through here this late." I shrugged, handing him my card. I just wanted to pay and leave. "Yeah, well, just passing through." He took the card, but he didn't run it right away. He just held it in his hand, staring at me. "You traveling alone?" That question made my skin crawl. I didn't like how he asked it, like he already knew the answer. I forced a smile, trying to act normal. "Yeah, just me." He finally swiped the card, but he was still watching me too closely. "Not always safe for a woman to be driving alone at night," he said, his smile still there, but it wasn't friendly. "You never know who you might run into." I didn't respond to that. I just wanted my card back so I could leave. My heart was starting to race, and I could feel the urge to run, but I stayed still, hoping I could get out of there without making things worse. He handed me the receipt, but before I could grab it, he spoke again. "Where are you headed from?" I took the receipt, slipping it into my pocket. "My parents' house," I said, keeping my answer short. He nodded slowly, like he was thinking about something. "That far?" Must have been a nice visit. I didn't reply, just gave him a tight smile and turned to leave. As I reached for the door, I felt his eyes on my back, that heavy, uncomfortable feeling you get when someone's staring too hard. I pushed open the door and hurried back to my car, my heart pounding in my chest. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the gas station, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw him standing in the doorway, watching me. His smile was gone, replaced by this blank, unsettling look. I drove down the road, trying to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But after a few minutes, I checked the mirror again, and that's when I saw the headlights behind me. At first, I thought it was just another car, someone else traveling through the area. But as I kept driving, the car stayed behind me, too close. Every turn I made, every bend in the road, it followed. My stomach dropped when I realized it was him. It had to be. The gas station was the only thing out there, and I hadn't passed any other cars. I tried to stay calm, telling myself he was just driving the same route, that it was a coincidence. But the longer it went on, the harder it was to believe that. He was following me. I was sure of it. I sped up a little, hoping he'd back off, but he didn't. He stayed right on my tail, so close that his headlights filled my car with light. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, and I started looking for a way out. There were no other cars around, no houses, no signs of life, just a dark road stretching out in front of me. I tried to think. What was I supposed to do? Call the police? But I didn't even know where I was. I hadn't seen a town in miles, and I didn't have a signal on my phone. I spotted a small side road up ahead, barely visible in the dark. I didn't know where it led, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from him. I made a sharp turn, my tires squealing on the asphalt, and took the narrow road, hoping he wouldn't follow. But he did. The headlights swerved behind me, and my heart raced as I realized he wasn't going to give up. I pressed down on the gas, speeding along the bumpy road, trying to put some distance between us. But the car stayed close, too close. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't keep driving forever, and there was nowhere to go. My mind was racing, trying to figure out a plan, but all I could think about was getting away from him. The road started to curve, and up ahead, I saw a sharp bend. I slowed down just enough to take the turn, but he didn't. His car skidded, the tires screeching as he lost control. For a split second, I saw his headlights swing wildly, and then there was a loud crash as his car slammed into the trees. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the wheel so hard they hurt. I didn't know if he was hurt or if he'd come after me again, but I wasn't taking any chances. Eventually, I found my way back to the main road. I drove for miles, not stopping, not slowing down, until I finally reached a small town with a 24-hour diner. I pulled into the parking lot, my hands still shaking as I parked the car. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I didn't know who that guy was, or what he wanted, but I knew one thing for sure: I was lucky to get away. I never took that route again. I've lived in the same small town for years. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other's names, and nothing much happens. There's only one post office, an old brick building on the edge of town. I've used it for years, never thought twice about it. It's just one of those places that fades into the background until it didn't. About 6 months ago, I started noticing something strange. The post office would be closed during regular hours, sometimes for a whole day. I'd show up to mail a package or pick something up, and the doors would be locked, lights off. No sign, no explanation, just closed. The first couple of times, I shrugged it off. Everyone needs a break, right? Maybe the postmaster was out sick or something. But it started happening more often. I checked the hours posted on the door, and I knew I wasn't going crazy. They were supposed to be open, but the place was locked up tight. People in town began to notice too. I'd hear them mention it at the grocery store, or at the diner, asking each other, what's going on with the post office? No one seemed to have any answers. The postmaster, this guy named Don, wasn't exactly the chatty type. He'd been working there as long as I could remember. He was always polite, always did his job, but something about him was a little off. He didn't smile much, and he rarely made eye contact. Still, it never struck me as anything more than a guy who didn't like his job. One day, I needed to send some important documents out. I had to get them in the mail that day, no exceptions. I drove to the post office at around 10 a.m., well within the open hours. But again, the doors were locked. This time, though, it wasn't dark inside. I could see lights on, and there was movement. Someone was in there. I knocked, but no one came to the door. I knocked again, harder, and then I heard muffled voices. It sounded like at least two people, maybe more, talking inside. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to hear, but the voices were too low to make out what they were saying. I knocked one more time, and finally, the door creaked open just a crack. Don was standing there, blocking the entrance. He didn't look surprised to see me, but there was something off in his eyes. He stared at me for a moment before speaking, his voice flat. "We're closed." "Closed?" I said, pointing at the sign. "It says you're open." He didn't even glance at the sign. "We're closed." I was starting to get frustrated. "I just need to send a package. It'll take 2 minutes." He didn't move. "Come back tomorrow." I tried to look past him, but he stepped in front of me, blocking my view of the inside. The voices I'd heard earlier were gone now, like they'd stopped the second I knocked. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a streak of what looked like dried mud on Don's shirt, smeared across his chest like he'd been in a hurry. His hands were shaking slightly, too. "What's going on in there?" I asked, my voice more firm this time. "Nothing," he said, but there was a tension in his voice that hadn't been there before. He glanced behind him, just for a second, but it was enough. "You should go." At that point, something clicked in my gut, and I knew something wasn't right. But before I could say anything else, Don stepped forward, pushing the door shut in my face. I heard the lock click into place, and then there was silence again. I stood there for a moment, just staring at the door. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Why was the place locked? Who was inside with Don, and why were they trying so hard to keep it hidden? I walked back to my car, my heart beating faster than it should have been. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Don standing at the window, watching me. It sent a chill down my spine. Something was wrong, and I wasn't about to let it go. The next day, I went back. This time, I didn't go during normal hours. I waited until after the post office was supposed to be closed. If Don was up to something, I figured it might be easier to catch him off guard. I parked a little way down the street and watched the building for a while. There were no cars, no signs of life. It looked completely deserted, but I didn't believe that for a second. After about an hour, I saw movement. The door opened, and Don stepped out, looking around like he was checking if anyone was watching. He didn't see me, tucked away in my car, and I watched as he locked the door behind him and walked off down the street. Once he was out of sight, I got out of my car and hurried toward the post office. I didn't have a key, but the door wasn't as secure as I thought it would be. It only took a few minutes of fiddling with the lock before I managed to get it open. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me. It was thick, heavy, like mildew and something rotten. The air was stale, like no one had been inside for days. But I knew that wasn't true. I'd seen Don here just hours earlier. I walked through the lobby, past the empty counters, and toward the back of the building where the mail was usually sorted. The lights were on, casting long shadows across the floor. As I moved deeper into the building, I heard something muffled sounds, almost like whispers. It was coming from a room down the hall. I crept closer, trying to stay quiet. The door to the room was cracked open, and I could see a dim light inside. I pushed the door open just enough to see what was inside. What I saw made my stomach turn. There was a man tied to a chair in the middle of the room, his head slumped forward. He was covered in dirt and blood, his clothes torn and filthy. He wasn't moving, but I could hear faint breaths coming from him. Next to him, on the floor, was a shovel covered in fresh dirt. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out of there, had to call the police. But as I turned to leave, I heard the door to the post office creak open. My blood ran cold. Don was back. I froze, my mind racing. I couldn't let him find me here. I glanced around the room, looking for a place to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The only thing I could do was stay quiet and hope he didn't come this way. I heard his footsteps getting closer, slow and deliberate. He was humming to himself, a low, tuneless sound that made my skin crawl. I pressed myself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I could see his shadow in the hallway, long and dark. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he'd hear it. But after what felt like an eternity, he moved on, his footsteps fading as he walked down the hall. I didn't waste any more time. As soon as I was sure he was far enough away, I slipped out of the room and made a run for the front door. I didn't look back. I just ran, my heart racing, my mind spinning with what I'd just seen. I didn't stop running until I was back in my car, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I called the police, told them everything I'd seen. They came, asked me questions, searched the post office. But by the time they got there, the man in the chair was gone. The room was empty, clean like nothing had ever happened. They found Don later that night, trying to leave town. He didn't put up a fight when they arrested him. Turns out, he'd been involved in some kind of smuggling operation, using the post office as a cover. The man I'd seen tied up was one of his partners who tried to back out of the deal. They never found the guy, though. I've always loved jogging in the park near my house. It's small, nothing fancy, just a loop that winds through some trees and a small pond. Quiet, peaceful, usually empty in the early mornings when I go. I like it that way. It's my time to clear my head before the day really starts. I'd been running there for years, so I never felt uneasy about it. Until that day. It started like any other morning. I woke up early, put on my running shoes, and headed out. The sky was still gray with just a bit of light coming through, but I liked that running while the town's still half asleep. The park was empty when I got there, just how I liked it. I parked my car in the usual spot, grabbed my water bottle, and started my usual route. I remember thinking it was colder than usual, or maybe it was just the wind picking up through the trees. Either way, it felt like a typical morning jog. About 10 minutes in, though, I got that weird feeling you get when you know someone's watching you. I glanced around but didn't see anyone. There's usually no one else around this early, and I shrugged it off, trying to focus on my breathing. But as I came around a curve in the path, something caught my eye. Off to the side, just past the tree line, I saw a figure. He was standing between two trees, not moving, just watching. I slowed down, thinking maybe it was another jogger or someone walking their dog. But there was no dog, no movement. Just a man, standing there, staring right at me. I tried to play it cool, picking up my pace again and telling myself it was no big deal. Maybe he was just some guy taking a break, or maybe he was lost. But something felt wrong. He didn't move, didn't look away. I glanced back over my shoulder as I ran, and he was still there, standing in the same spot, watching me. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it was hard to focus. My legs felt heavier, my breath quicker. I kept running, but I could feel my heart pounding harder than it should have been. The trees felt like they were closing in on me. The path ahead seemed too long. I just wanted to finish my run and get back to my car. When I got to the far end of the loop, where the trees thinned out near the pond, I looked back again. This time, he wasn't in the same spot. But he wasn't gone either. He'd moved. He was closer now, about halfway down the path, still just standing there, still staring. My stomach dropped. I wasn't imagining it. He was following me. I forced myself to keep running, even though my legs felt like they were turning to lead. I just wanted to get back to my car, get out of there. My mind was racing, trying to figure out if I should confront him, if I should call someone, but all I could focus on was putting one foot in front of the other. As I neared the end of the loop, where the parking lot was, I started to feel a little bit of relief. The lot wasn't far now, and once I was in my car, I'd be safe. I could lock the doors, drive home, forget this ever happened. But when I got to the parking lot, that relief vanished. My car was sitting there, same as always, but something was wrong. The tires, they were flat. All four of them. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, that maybe I was too freaked out to think clearly, but no. They were definitely flat. Someone had let the air out. I stopped dead in my tracks, panic hitting me like a wave. My eyes darted around, searching for anyone else, but the lot was empty. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot now, just a few yards away. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was walking toward me, slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. He was getting closer. I don't remember making the decision to run, but suddenly I was sprinting, heading for the park entrance. My phone was in my car, my keys too, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from him. I didn't look back, didn't check to see if he was following. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The entrance wasn't far, but it felt like it took forever to reach it. I burst out of the park and onto the street, not stopping until I was a good distance away. I turned back then, gasping for breath, but he wasn't there. The park entrance was empty. For a second, I thought maybe I'd lost him. Maybe he wasn't following me after all. Maybe he was just some guy, and I'd overreacted. But then I saw him again, standing just inside the park, barely visible through the trees. He wasn't chasing me, but he wasn't leaving either. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't go back to my car, and I couldn't stay here. There were no houses nearby, no one to ask for help. I was completely alone. I started walking, not sure where I was going, just trying to put as much distance between me and him as I could. My mind was racing, thinking about all the stories you hear, all the warnings about going places alone. I'd always thought they were exaggerated. Nothing like that ever happened around here. But now, it was happening to me. I walked for what felt like hours, checking over my shoulder every few seconds, but I didn't see him again. Eventually, I reached a gas station on the edge of town. The clerk looked up as I walked in, probably noticing how disheveled I looked, but I didn't care. I walked straight to the counter, my hands shaking as I asked to use the phone. The police arrived a little while later. I told them what had happened, how the man had been watching me, how he'd flattened my tires. They asked me if I'd seen him do it, if I knew who he was, but I didn't have any answers. I'd never seen him before in my life. They offered to take me back to my car, and I agreed, though the thought of going back there made me feel sick. When we got to the park, my car was still sitting there, the tires flat, just like I'd left it. But the man was gone. There was no sign of him anywhere. The police looked around, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no evidence, nothing. They changed my tires for me, told me to be careful, and sent me on my way. I drove home in a daze, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't feel safe until I was back in my house, with all the doors locked and the windows closed. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. I've always been interested in my family's history, and after years of listening to old stories from relatives, I decided to dig a little deeper. I had traced my family back to a small town, one that wasn't far from where I lived. My great-grandfather had grown up there, and I thought it might be interesting to learn more about his life and the town itself. I didn't expect much. Just thought I'd spend a quiet afternoon going through some old records. The town wasn't exactly a tourist destination. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and seemed like the kind of place where not much ever happened. The main street had a few shops, a diner, and the library where I was headed. The library was small, tucked between two other buildings, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Inside, it smelled like old books and dust. There was a single librarian sitting behind the desk, a woman who looked like she had been working there forever. She glanced up when I walked in, but didn't say anything. Just watched me as I made my way over to the records section. I wasn't sure where to start, so I grabbed a few old newspapers and started flipping through them. Most of it was just local news, nothing exciting. I was about to give up and leave when I found something strange. It was a small article, buried in the back of a paper from the 1950s. It mentioned a missing person, just a brief note about a man who had disappeared without a trace. There wasn't much information, just a name and the date he was last seen. I didn't think much of it at first. Missing persons happen everywhere, even in quiet towns like this. But then I found another article. And another. All about people who had disappeared over the years. The more I looked, the more I found. It seemed like every few years, someone would just vanish. The articles were always short, always vague. No follow-up, no explanation. Just gone. I went back to the librarian, carrying a few of the articles with me. When I asked her about it, her expression changed. At first, she acted like she didn't know what I was talking about. But when I showed her the articles, she got defensive. said it wasn't something people around here talked about. That made me curious. Why wouldn't they talk about it? I wasn't asking for much, just wanted to know if there was any more information. Maybe there had been a string of kidnappings or something, and they didn't want to scare people. I figured there had to be more to it than just these little notes in the paper. But the librarian got this weird look in her eyes. She leaned in close and told me I should stop looking into it. Said I was digging into things that were better left alone. I thought she was being dramatic, trying to make it sound more mysterious than it really was. But there was something about the way she said it that made my skin crawl. I went back to the records, ignoring her warning. I found an old file, tucked away in a drawer that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. It was full of information on local missing persons cases. Dozens of them, going back decades. Names, dates, descriptions. All of them were locals. All of them disappeared in or near the town. As I read through the file, I started to notice a pattern. The disappearances weren't random. They all happened around the same time of year, late summer, just a few weeks apart. And they all happened in the same general area, a part of town that was mostly abandoned now. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but it felt like there was something more to it. Something the town didn't want people to know. I decided to ask the librarian again, this time pushing for more answers. When I brought up the file, she looked genuinely angry. Told me I needed to leave, that I shouldn't be snooping around in things I didn't understand. She said it was dangerous, that people had been hurt before because they didn't listen. I didn't know what to make of it. Why was she so upset? It was just old news, nothing more than that. But the more she talked, the more I realized she was scared. Not angry, scared. She kept glancing around like someone might be listening, her voice dropping to a whisper as she told me to leave town, to forget what I'd seen. I didn't leave. I should have, but I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was on the verge of uncovering something. Something important. I decided to go to the area where most of the disappearances had happened. It was only a few blocks away, and I figured it couldn't hurt to take a look. The area was run down, like I expected. A few boarded-up buildings, overgrown yards. It looked like no one had lived there in years. But as I walked through the streets, I got this feeling like I was being watched. Every time I turned around, there was no one there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something. I found an old house that matched the description in one of the articles. It was one of the last places a missing person had been seen before they vanished. The door was locked, but a window around the back was broken, so I climbed in. The inside was just as run down as the outside, dust everywhere, old furniture covered in sheets. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but the house felt wrong. I can't explain it. It was just a house, empty like all the others, but something about it made my skin crawl. It was too quiet, too still. I started to leave when I heard footsteps outside. At first, I thought maybe it was just someone passing by, but they didn't go away. They got closer. Slow, deliberate steps, coming right toward the house. My heart was pounding in my chest as I crouched behind an old couch, hoping whoever it was would just leave. But they didn't. The door creaked open, and I heard someone step inside. I couldn't see them from where I was hiding, but I could hear them walking through the house, their footsteps echoing off the walls. They were moving slowly, like they were looking for something. Or someone. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing, praying they wouldn't find me. The footsteps got closer, then stopped. I could hear them right on the other side of the couch. I thought for sure they had found me, that any second now they'd reach down and grab me. But after a moment, the footsteps moved away. I listened as they walked through the house, then out the door. I waited a long time before I moved, just in case they were still outside. When I finally got up, I made a run for it, climbing back out the window and sprinting back to the main street. I didn't stop running until I was back at the library. The librarian was waiting for me. She must have known I would come back. She didn't say anything, just shook her head and handed me an envelope. I didn't open it until I got back to my car. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was old, yellowed with age, and the handwriting was hard to read. But it was a list of names. All the names I had seen in the missing persons file, plus a few more. At the bottom of the list was a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. Leave. Before you're next. I didn't need any more convincing. I left town that day and never went back. I don't know what's going on in that town, and I don't want to know. But I'm sure of one thing, the people there know exactly what's happening. And they don't want anyone else finding out. I hadn't been back to that town in years. My mom's family was from there, a small place out in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those towns you'd never hear about unless you knew someone who lived there. After my grandparents passed, we stopped visiting. There wasn't much reason to go back until the funeral. It was my great-aunt who died. I didn't know her well, just met her a few times when I was little. She was a nice woman, from what I remembered, but we weren't close. Still, my mom insisted we go. Family was family, she said. So I drove her there, a couple of hours from where we lived, and found myself in that tiny town again. The funeral home was old, with a creaky sign hanging out front. It looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, but that didn't seem unusual for a place like this. Everything moved slower here. The town itself was almost eerie in how quiet it was, even for a funeral day. Not many people were walking around, and the streets felt deserted. I figured everyone was either at work or attending the service. We went inside, signed the guest book, and took our seats in the back. The room was small, maybe 30 chairs lined up in rows facing the casket at the front. There was a soft murmur as people talked in hushed voices, but no one seemed too upset. Most of the people there were older, and I guess they'd known my great-aunt for years. My mom whispered that a lot of them probably grew up with her. The funeral director was standing by the casket. He was tall and thin, dressed in a black suit that looked too big for him. His hair was slicked back, and he had this strange smile on his face, like he was trying too hard to be polite, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Something about him made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just the weird atmosphere. As the service began, I tried to pay attention, but my eyes kept drifting toward the casket. The lid was half open, just enough so you could see the body inside. It wasn't something I liked to look at, but I couldn't help it. My great-aunt was there, dressed in a pale blue gown, her hands folded neatly on her chest. She looked peaceful, but something about it felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became that something was wrong. Her face. It didn't look right. I leaned over to my mom and whispered, "Does she look different to you?" Mom glanced over, squinting. She shook her head, but I could tell she wasn't really looking. She just thought I was being sensitive. It was a funeral, after all. People don't look the same once they're gone. I tried to tell myself that, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the woman in the casket wasn't my great-aunt. After the service, people started lining up to pay their final respects. I stood with my mom, waiting for our turn, but my eyes kept flicking toward the funeral director. He was watching the line, smiling that same forced smile. When we got to the casket, I hesitated. My mom stepped forward, placing a hand on the edge of the casket, whispering something under her breath. I just stared at the body. It wasn't her. I was sure of it now. The face, the hands, even the way the gown fit, it was all wrong. This wasn't my great-aunt. I turned to the funeral director, trying to catch his eye. He noticed me staring and came over, still smiling. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice smooth but cold. I swallowed hard. "That's not her." He tilted his head, his smile fading for just a second before it came back, whiter this time. "I assure you, that's Mrs. Hargrove. We've taken great care to prepare her for today." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "That's not her." My mom tugged on my arm, trying to pull me away. "Stop it," she whispered. "You're making a scene." But I couldn't leave it alone. The more I looked, the more certain I became. I turned back to the funeral director. "Who is this?" His eyes narrowed, and the smile vanished completely. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This is not the time for that. You need to be respectful." I glanced around. No one else seemed to notice what was going on. They were all still lined up, paying their respects, completely unaware of the wrong body lying in the casket. My heart was racing. Something was seriously wrong here. "I need to leave," I muttered to my mom, pulling away from her grip. The funeral director moved in front of me, blocking my path. "I'm afraid I can't let you do that," he said, his voice flat and cold now. "What are you talking about?" I tried to step around him, but he grabbed my arm, hard. His fingers dug into my skin, and I gasped. "You've seen too much," he whispered, leaning in close. "It would be best if you stayed quiet." I pulled back, trying to shake off his grip, but he held on tight. "Let go of me," I hissed. He didn't budge. His eyes were cold, almost lifeless, as he stared at me. "You need to stay quiet. Understand?" My mom noticed now, her eyes white with confusion. "What's going on?" she asked, stepping closer. "Nothing," the funeral director said quickly, his grip still tight on my arm. "Just a misunderstanding. Your daughter's a bit upset, that's all." I yanked my arm free, my heart pounding in my chest. "We're leaving," I said, louder this time. The funeral director stepped back, his smile returning, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course. I'm sure you'll feel better once you've had some time." My mom grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. I could feel the funeral director's eyes on me the whole way out. As soon as we were outside, I turned to my mom, trying to explain, but she just shook her head. "You're being ridiculous," she said. "It's a funeral, emotions run high." I knew she wouldn't believe me, but I couldn't let it go. That wasn't her in the casket. I didn't know who it was, but it wasn't my great-aunt. Something was wrong, and the funeral director knew it. He was hiding something, something terrible. We got into the car, and I told my mom I needed a minute. I sat there, staring at the funeral home, my hands shaking. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't prove anything. No one would believe me. But I knew what I saw. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The funeral director was standing in the doorway, watching us. His face was blank now, no smile, no expression at all. Just watching. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about that body in the casket, the cold look in the funeral director's eyes, the way he grabbed my arm. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger, that he wouldn't let this go. A few days later, I got a call from my mom. She'd heard from one of her cousins that the funeral home had been shut down. The state had gotten involved after some complaints, and they found evidence of something. She didn't know the details, just that the place was under investigation. I never found out what happened to the real body. I never went back to that town, and I don't plan to. But I can't stop thinking about it. About what the funeral director said. "You've seen too much." I don't know what he meant by that, but I have a feeling I was lucky to get out when I did. I went to the local barber shop last week, just looking for a quick haircut. Nothing fancy, just to clean up, and I figured it would be a good way to start the weekend. I'd been to this place a few times before. It was an old shop, kind of run down, but that's the charm of a small town, right? The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and you'd usually end up talking to someone you hadn't seen in years, no matter when you walked in. I didn't recognize the guy cutting hair that day, but that wasn't unusual. They seemed to have someone new there pretty often. This guy had gray hair and a weathered face. He looked to be in his 60s, maybe older. He was quick and quiet at first, just asking how I wanted my hair cut, nothing more. I told him short on the sides, keep the top a little longer, and sat back, trying to relax. At first, everything felt normal. He worked fast, his scissors snipping away, and there was that steady buzz of the clippers. It wasn't until he started talking that things felt off. "So, you've been living here long?" he asked, out of nowhere. I answered, "A few years now. Moved here for work, settled down." He nodded, like he was listening but not really interested in my answer. Then he paused for a moment, running his fingers through my hair before snipping again. "You know, people don't leave this town once they come," he said, almost casually. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring it was just small-town banter. It's a common thing, really. People like to talk about how everyone who comes here ends up staying. But the way he said it was strange. Like it wasn't just an observation, but a statement about something more. I chuckled lightly. "Yeah, I guess people get comfortable. Pretty quiet place here." His hand stopped for a moment, and I felt his eyes on me through the mirror. He looked at me like he was sizing me up. Quiet is right. Real quiet. Almost like the place keeps people, you know? He went back to cutting, his voice soft but sharper now, like he was speaking in a lower, more deliberate tone. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and said, "Yeah, I guess." There was a pause. I glanced around the shop, and it suddenly felt a bit too still. There wasn't anyone else there. The door, which was usually left open for fresh air, was closed. I assumed maybe someone had closed it to keep out the wind, but it struck me as odd that I hadn't noticed him close it. He kept cutting, but his tone turned a little darker. "You ever wonder why people don't leave?" I shrugged. "Not really. I mean, it's a nice town, I guess. What's not to like?" He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was one of those smiles that felt like it had some hidden meaning behind it. "It's not the town that keeps people. It's something else. Something people don't like to talk about." I looked at him through the mirror, my stomach tightening. I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but I didn't want to make it obvious. It wasn't like I could just get up and walk out. I didn't know what his deal was, but he didn't seem dangerous at first, just strange. "I don't know what you mean," I said, trying to keep the conversation light. "What do you mean by something else?" His scissors paused for a second, and then he set them down on the counter. He turned to face me. "You're not from here, are you?" I felt my heart skip a beat. "Ah, like I said, I've been here for a few years now." He stepped a little closer, his eyes never leaving mine, and his voice dropped even lower. You know what happens to people who try to leave? I froze for a moment, not sure if he was messing around or if this was going somewhere I didn't want it to. My mind raced. I didn't think he was joking anymore, and the way he was looking at me sent a chill down my spine. People try to leave all the time, I said, keeping my voice steady, but my hands were starting to shake. His face hardened. No, they don't. I glanced toward the door, but I noticed the key hanging on the wall behind him. It was hanging from a hook right next to the door, and I realized the door was locked. It had been locked the entire time I'd been there. I shifted in the chair. Is there a reason the door's locked? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, but my nerves were already starting to fray. He smiled again, but this time it wasn't comforting at all. It was almost like he was daring me to speak again. You ever wonder why no one ever leaves? The air felt thick suddenly, and I was starting to panic. My palms were sweating. I stood up, pretending I was just going to check my phone, but I was really trying to figure out how I could get out of there. Look, man, I'm just here for a haircut, I said, trying to sound calm. I don't know what you're talking about. I need to go. I reached for the door handle, but it didn't move. I tugged harder. The handle was jammed, stuck in place. I tried pulling it harder, but it wouldn't budge. My heart started pounding. I felt the blood rush to my ears. The barber was standing just behind me now, watching me with that same unnerving smile. No one ever leaves once they come, he said softly, his breath warm on the back of my neck. We all stay here. We're part of the town. No one ever leaves. I turned around, trying to stay calm, but my legs were shaking. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at me, like he was studying my face. You're not going to leave either, he said. We've got things here. We don't let people leave. It's better that way. I felt trapped, and my mind was racing. I could feel the weight of the situation settling in. I had to get out. I couldn't let this guy, this freaky old barber, keep me here. There was something wrong with this place. I should have known it when I first walked in. I should have left the moment he started talking like that. I backed up, away from the barber, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I reached into my pocket, trying to find my phone, but my hands were shaking too badly to hold it steady. I couldn't let him get close. Why won't you just let me go? I shouted, but my voice cracked. He didn't say anything. He just took another step closer, still smiling like he was enjoying this. In a panic, I ran to the back of the shop, trying the back door. It was locked, too. I could hear the barber's slow, deliberate footsteps behind me. I didn't have a choice anymore. I couldn't think of a way out. I had to do something. I grabbed a metal comb off the counter and turned to face him. The look in his eyes sent a jolt of fear through me. I rushed at him, swinging the comb toward him, desperate to push him back. For a second, I think I caught him off guard. He stumbled, and I bolted past him, out the door. I ran into the street, my heart racing, not stopping until I was far enough away. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window. I still don't know what he meant about no one leaving, but I haven't gone back to that town since. Every time I think about it, my hands still shake. I still remember how he said no one ever leaves. And I don't know if it's just a creepy threat or if there's something darker going on in that town. I moved to a small town last spring. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone, and people looked at you a little longer than usual if they didn't recognize you. But I figured that was normal in a place like that. I'd come from the city, and I was used to being just another face in the crowd, so the change felt different. The air was cleaner, people said hello on the street, and I thought it would be a good place to settle down. A few months after I moved in, I heard there was going to be a town meeting at the community center. They held these meetings every so often, and it seemed like the kind of thing I should start attending if I wanted to really be a part of the town. I hadn't met too many people, so I thought it would be a good chance to introduce myself. The flyer said it was a newcomer's night where they welcomed people who'd moved to the area recently. I got there early and found a seat near the middle. The room was small, with folding chairs set up in rows and a table up front where a few people from the town council were sitting. There was a podium, too, and a few sheets of paper scattered on the table, probably some kind of agenda. The lights were bright, and there was a strange buzz coming from somewhere. I couldn't tell if it was the lights or maybe just my nerves. More people started coming in, most of them chatting in low voices. I saw a few familiar faces from the local shops, but I didn't know anyone well enough to say hi. As I looked around, I noticed something odd. The people who had been sitting near me were getting up and moving to different seats, away from where I was. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, but as more people filled the room, it became more obvious. They all seemed to keep their distance from me. The meeting started with a man named Gary at the podium. He looked like the kind of guy who'd lived there his whole life, heavy-set, with a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. He welcomed everyone, especially the newcomers, and talked a bit about the town's history. It was the usual small-town stuff, old buildings, festivals, things like that. But when he finished, and it was time for people to speak, there was a shift. It was like the air got thicker. Someone from the back spoke up, a woman with gray hair, wearing a faded cardigan. She didn't look at me when she spoke, but her voice carried through the room. "Don't you think we should talk about the incidents?" she said. Gary didn't seem surprised. He nodded slowly and glanced over at the other council members, who were all looking down at their hands or their papers. He turned back to the woman and said, "I think it's fair to address that, Ruth. It's on everyone's mind." I didn't know what incidents they were talking about, and nobody was explaining it. There were murmurs from some of the others, and I felt more ice drifting in my direction. I didn't know why, but I could feel it. There was a man a couple of rows ahead of me who kept glancing over his shoulder. Every time I caught his eye, he'd turn back around quickly, like he didn't want me to see him looking. Then another person spoke up, this time a man in his 60s, his voice sharp. "We've had our share of problems since folks started moving in," he said. "Things disappearing, people not feeling safe in their own homes." I wanted to stand up and say something, to ask what this had to do with me, but I couldn't find the right moment. The more they talked, the more the room seemed to close in. It was like they weren't having a meeting anymore, they were having an argument, but I wasn't sure with who. It was like they were all arguing at me without actually saying it. Someone else chimed in, a younger woman with dark hair tied back. "Maybe it's time we started asking who's really a part of this town and who's just passing through," she said, her voice tight. She didn't look directly at me, but her words were pointed enough. Gary cleared his throat and tried to keep the meeting on track, but it was no use. The whole thing had shifted into something else, something that wasn't on any agenda. People kept bringing up vague complaints about newcomers, strangers, they called them. Someone mentioned the old house on Birch Street that had been broken into a few weeks ago, and another person mentioned finding their dog wandering far from home one night. I felt my stomach twist. It wasn't just the accusations, there was something else in the way they talked. It was like they had already decided who was to blame for whatever had happened, and they didn't need any proof. I didn't know anyone here well enough to have done anything to them, but that didn't seem to matter. They kept hinting around it, like they didn't need to say my name out loud for everyone to know who they were talking about. I finally found the nerve to speak up. "I'm sorry. I don't understand what this has to do with me," I said. My voice sounded small in the room. Nobody answered right away. Gary looked like he was going to say something, but then he stopped. The older man who had spoken before turned around in his chair, fixing his eyes on me. "We know you're new here," he said slowly. "And maybe you don't know how things work in a small town, but people pay attention. What are you trying to say?" I asked, standing up from my seat. The room went quiet. Too quiet. Everyone was staring now. I could feel sweat on my back, my hands starting to tremble. Gary spoke again, his voice soft, almost like he was trying to calm a child. "We're just saying, maybe you should keep an eye on your behavior," he said. "People are watching, and we notice things. Little things that don't sit right." I felt trapped. The door to the hall was on the other side of the room, and I wasn't sure I could make it out without someone trying to stop me. I could see people starting to shift in their seats, leaning forward just slightly. It felt like they were closing in. I turned on my heel and walked straight for the exit, not waiting for Gary or anyone else to say another word. I pushed open the doors and didn't look back, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't know what had just happened in there or why they were acting like that. I hurried to my car and locked the doors as soon as I got in, starting the engine and driving away. The next day, I started packing up. I didn't need to be told twice. I wasn't going to stick around and find out what happened next. As I left town, I saw some of the people from the meeting out on their porches or standing by their cars, just watching me drive away. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just kept going, and I haven't gone back since. My car broke down late in the afternoon. I was about halfway through my road trip, somewhere in a town I didn't even catch the name of. I'd been driving for hours, and the engine started making a knocking sound. I thought it was the kind of thing I could push through, just get to the next city or even a rest area, but after another few miles, it just died completely. I coasted onto the shoulder and sat there for a minute, just staring at the dashboard, hoping it'd start right up again, but it didn't. The engine didn't even turn over. I was stuck. There wasn't much around, just a small auto shop down the road. It was the only place I'd seen for a while. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but I couldn't get a signal. I remember feeling that sinking feeling in my stomach, realizing I'd have to walk over there. It wasn't far, maybe a quarter mile, but I felt exposed out there on the open road with nothing but fields on either side. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across everything. I reached the shop, and it looked like it had been there forever, one of those places that seems frozen in time. The paint was peeling off the walls, and there was a sign out front that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. There was a man behind the counter, older, with a scruffy beard and a stained blue jumpsuit. He glanced up when I came in. "Car trouble?" he asked, though it was pretty obvious. I told him what happened, and he said he could take a look but wouldn't be able to get any parts until the next day. He offered to tow my car back to the shop for a fee, and I didn't have much choice, so I agreed. We took his old tow truck back up the road, and he hooked up my car without saying much. Back at the shop, he had me pull up a chair in the waiting area while he started checking under the hood. The place was cluttered, like 100 projects had been left half-finished. There was a faint smell of oil and metal, the kind that gets in your nose and sticks. I sat there, just hoping it wouldn't be a big fix. After what felt like an hour, he came back in and said the engine was shot. Something about a blown head gasket, though he wasn't clear on the details. He said there was no way he'd be able to fix it until tomorrow at the earliest. I was stuck there for the night. You can sleep in here if you want, he said, like it was nothing. Got caught in the back, not the best, but better than the car. I didn't like the idea, but the town was so small, I doubted there was a motel around, and I didn't see any other options. I asked him how much it'd be to fix the car, and he just shrugged, like he hadn't thought about it yet. Depends on what I gotta do, he said. We'll figure it out in the morning. I didn't feel right about it. Something about the whole thing seemed off, but I told myself I was just tired. I went to the cot he'd set up in the back, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, little clinks and clatters from outside. I told myself it was just him working on something, but it didn't sound like tools. It was more like footsteps, and sometimes they seemed too close to the window near where I was lying. After a while, the noises stopped, and I finally drifted off. I woke up suddenly to a faint scraping sound, like metal on metal. It was coming from the direction of my car. I got up and walked out to the shop floor. The man was standing by my car, his back to me. He was working on something, but I couldn't see what it was. When I got closer, I noticed he'd taken one of the wheels off and had the hood propped open again. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the empty shop. He didn't look up. "Thought I'd get a head start," he said. "No harm in getting things ready for tomorrow." Something wasn't right. I mean, who works on a car in the middle of the night like that? I stepped closer, trying to see what he was really doing, and I saw that he had my car battery out and a few other parts laid out on a cloth. It didn't look like he was fixing anything, it looked more like he was taking it apart. "I thought you said it was too late to work on it," I said, and that's when he finally turned to look at me. His eyes were dark, like they were set too far back in his skull, and there was something in his expression that made my skin crawl. "Go back to bed," he said, his voice low and steady. "You don't need to be out here." I felt a jolt of fear run through me, but I forced myself to keep calm. I mumbled something about being restless and backed away, heading back to the cot. But I didn't go back to sleep. I just sat there, my heart pounding, listening for more sounds. I didn't know what his deal was, but I knew I wasn't going to stick around to find out. When I was sure he wasn't looking, I crept back out to the shop floor and checked my car. He'd taken out more than just the battery. There were a few other parts missing, stuff I didn't recognize. It looked like he was making sure it wouldn't be able to start again. I glanced back toward the office and saw him coming out, wiping his hands on a rag. I ducked down behind the car just in time. He walked right past where I was hiding, muttering to himself. He went over to a cabinet and pulled out a tool I didn't recognize. It had a long handle and a sharp edge, and he gripped it like he knew exactly how to use it. I didn't wait to see what he was planning. I crawled around to the other side of the car, trying to stay out of his line of sight. My hands were shaking, and I didn't know if I could make it to the front door without him noticing. I was halfway there when I heard him say, "Where do you think you're going?" I didn't look back. I ran for the door, yanking it open and bolting outside. I heard his footsteps behind me, the door slamming shut. I took off down the road, my lungs burning, not even sure where I was going. I just knew I needed to get away from him. I saw some lights up ahead and realized there was a diner about a mile down the road. I kept running, even though my legs were screaming at me to stop. When I finally reached it, I burst through the doors, gasping for breath. The woman behind the counter looked up, startled. "Are you okay?" she asked. I didn't even know what to say. I just shook my head, pointing back down the road toward the shop. She called the police, and when they showed up, I told them what happened. They went to the shop, but by the time they got there, the man was gone. The place was locked up like nothing had happened, but they found the tools he'd been using, and my car was still half disassembled. The police didn't seem too surprised when I described the man to them. They said he'd been a problem before, though they didn't go into details. They towed my car to another shop in a different town, where it finally got fixed. I never found out what his real intentions were, and I'm not sure I want to know. I haven't been back through that area since, and I don't plan on it. There's just something about being stranded in a place where no one knows you, where there's nowhere to run, that still makes me uneasy. I decided to take a weekend for myself at a bed and breakfast in a small town a few hours away. I'd booked the place because the photos online made it look cozy, like the kind of spot where you could just disconnect for a while. The house was old, one of those Victorian-style places with a big porch out front and lace curtains in the windows. When I arrived, the owner, a woman named Nora, greeted me at the door. She seemed friendly enough at first, smiling and shaking my hand like she'd known me for years. She showed me around, pointing out the dining room where breakfast would be served and the little sitting area that had a couple of armchairs and a shelf of books. She took me up to my room on the second floor. It was nice, just as the picture showed, with a big four-poster bed and a view of the garden out back. She lingered at the door after I'd set my bag down, asking if I needed anything else, then started asking where I was from and if I had come out here alone. Her tone was casual, but the questions felt strange to me, like they weren't just small talk. I told her I was here by myself for the weekend, just trying to get away from work for a bit. She nodded and said she understood, then she asked if I had family nearby, or if anyone knew where I was staying. I remember feeling a little put off by that. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd usually ask a guest, but I brushed it off, thinking she was just being curious. I answered as vaguely as I could, said something about a friend who knew where I was. She looked at me for a second, then just said she hoped I enjoyed my stay and left. That night, I was lying in bed, reading one of the books I'd picked up from the sitting area, when I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. At first, I thought it might just be another guest, but then I remembered I was the only one there. Nora had mentioned that earlier. The place was completely booked up the previous week, but I'd come at a slow time. The footsteps were quiet, like someone trying not to make noise, and they stopped right outside my door. I got up and walked over to the door, pressing my ear against it. I didn't hear anything else, just the faint sound of the wind outside. I almost opened it but then felt stupid for being so jumpy. I figured it was probably nothing and went back to bed, but I didn't fall asleep right away. I lay there, listening, half expecting the footsteps to start up again. The next morning, I noticed that some of my things weren't where I'd left them. I had my phone charger plugged in near the nightstand, and now it was wound up neatly and placed on the desk. I was sure I didn't do that. My suitcase, which I'd left unzipped, was now closed and buckled up. It was just little things, but they felt wrong, like someone had been in there while I was asleep. At breakfast, Nora acted completely normal, serving me coffee and chatting about the town. I kept trying to catch any hint that she knew more than she was letting on, but she just smiled and kept the conversation light. She didn't mention anything about the night before, or ask if I'd slept well, which seemed strange because that's the sort of thing you'd expect someone running a bed and breakfast to ask, right? I wanted to bring up what I heard, but I felt ridiculous. If it had been her in the hall, she'd probably just deny it, or maybe even think I was accusing her of something. The second night, I was even more on edge. I locked my door and pushed a chair in front of it just in case. It made me feel a little better, but not much. I left the lamp on and tried to distract myself with more reading, but I couldn't focus. It felt like the room was pressing in on me. I'd been listening so hard for any sound that when I finally heard a faint scraping outside the window, I jumped. It was soft at first, then got louder, like someone was brushing against the side of the house. I got out of bed and moved slowly toward the window. I didn't see anyone, but I noticed that one of the shutters was open. I was almost sure they'd both been closed when I come up to the room earlier. I backed away and went back to the chair I'd propped against the door, just standing there, not sure what to do. It was like I was waiting for something, but I didn't know what. Eventually, I did fall asleep, but it wasn't restful. I kept waking up, feeling like I'd heard something but not being sure if I dreamed it. When morning came, I felt more exhausted than I had before I'd come on this so-called getaway. I started packing up to leave. As I was zipping up my suitcase, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. My toothbrush, which had been on the sink the night before, was now in my bag. It was wrapped in a small plastic bag that wasn't mine. I hadn't touched it since I'd arrived. I went downstairs to check out, and Nora was there, smiling as always. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked if she'd come into my room at all during my stay. Her smile faded just a little, and there was a quick flash of something in her eyes, annoyance, maybe, or recognition, but it was gone so fast I couldn't be sure. She told me she'd had no reason to go up there and asked if everything was all right. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and handed her the payment. I was almost out the door when she said, "You left your window unlocked last night, you know?" I froze and turned to look at her. There was something in the way she said it, like she knew it would get under my skin. I hadn't told her about the shutter being open. I hadn't even mentioned the window. I forced a smile and told her thanks, then hurried out to my car. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced back at the house and saw her standing on the porch, watching me go. She had that same smile, but there was something different about it now, like it was more for her than for me. I drove straight home and didn't stop until I was well out of that town. For the rest of the drive, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I hadn't noticed while I was there, something she'd done or said that I'd missed. I kept going over every little detail in my head, wondering what could have happened if I hadn't left when I did. I'm not sure what her deal was or what she was trying to do, but I've never stayed at a bed and breakfast again. There's just something about staying in a stranger's house that doesn't sit right with me anymore. I was passing through a small town on my way back from a long drive, somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I'd been on the road for hours and started to feel a headache coming on, probably from dehydration and just sitting too long behind the wheel. I remembered I had a prescription in my glove box from a while back, some headache meds my doctor had given me but I never filled. I figured I'd stop at the first pharmacy I found, get it filled, and then I could make the last couple of hours home without my head pounding. I pulled into this small pharmacy on the corner of a quiet street. It looked old-fashioned, the kind of place you'd see in a movie set in the 1950s. There were only 2 cars in the lot, and I didn't see anyone inside at first, just the lights on and some dusty shelves through the windows. I hesitated before going in, wondering if the place was even still open, but the door wasn't locked and a little bell jingled as I walked in. There was a faint smell, like medicine mixed with something musty. The shelves were filled with the usual stuff, over-the-counter meds, bandages, some toiletries, but it all looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. The counter was at the back, and behind it was a man in a white coat, probably in his late 50s or early 60s, with thinning hair and glasses that sat crooked on his nose. He didn't look up right away, just kept scribbling something on a clipboard. "Excuse me," I said, holding up the folded prescription slip. "Could I get this filled?" He looked up then, and his eyes locked onto mine for a second too long before drifting down to the paper I handed him. He took it from me and scanned it over, then nodded slowly. "Sure," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'll get that ready for you. Might take a few minutes." We don't get many people coming in this time of day. I just nodded and wandered around the store while he disappeared into the back. I thought I heard some clattering back there, like bottles being knocked over, but I figured he was just digging around to find the right meds. I picked up a magazine and flipped through it, but the pages were yellowed and old, so I put it back. After a while, the pharmacist came back out and set a small paper bag on the counter. He had this weird little smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes, and I didn't like the way he was looking at me. "Here you go," he said. "That'll be $15. I handed him a 20, and he put the change on the counter without counting it back to me. When I reached for the bag, I noticed the label on the bottle inside wasn't the medication I had been prescribed. It was some other name I didn't recognize, and I pointed that out to him. "Ah, this isn't what I asked for," I said. "This isn't the right medication." His smile stayed fixed in place, but there was a slight shift in his expression, like he was annoyed that I even brought it up. "It's the same thing," he said. "Just a generic version. Does the same job, probably even better." I was pretty sure it wasn't. I wasn't about to take something I didn't recognize, especially not from a place that didn't look like it got much business. "I'd rather have what was on the prescription," I insisted. "I'll wait if you need more time." His face hardened then. "It's the same thing," he repeated, this time with a bit of a bite to his words. "I know what I'm doing. Been doing this a long time." He kept his hand on the bag as I reached for it again, like he wasn't going to let me take it unless I agreed to what he was saying. "I just prefer what I was prescribed," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Or maybe I'll just get it filled somewhere else." His hand tightened around the top of the paper bag, and he leaned across the counter a little. "You're not going anywhere until you take what I gave you," he said, and his voice was low and steady, almost like he was trying to threaten me without raising his voice. A chill ran through me. I didn't know if he was just some old guy with a bad temper or if something was seriously wrong here, but I wasn't about to argue with him anymore. "All right, fine," I said, taking the bag from him. "I'll just take this and be on my way." As I backed away from the counter, I saw his eyes following me, watching every step I took toward the door. The moment I pushed the door open, I heard him say, "Take it as soon as you can. It'll work better that way." There was something off about the way he said it, like there was a hidden meaning behind the words, and I didn't wait around to find out what he meant. I got to my car and tossed the bag onto the passenger seat, started the engine, and pulled out of that lot as fast as I could without peeling out. When I was a few miles out of town, I finally took the bottle out of the bag and looked at it closer. It wasn't even close to what I had been prescribed. The label didn't match anything I'd heard of, and when I searched the name on my phone, I couldn't find any results for it. No information at all, like it didn't exist. The pill color was different too, a pale blue instead of the white ones I'd been prescribed. I wasn't sure what I'd just been given, but I knew one thing: I wasn't about to swallow any of it. I pulled over and tossed the whole bag into a trash bin at the side of the road. Then I just sat there for a few minutes, trying to shake the feeling that I'd just escaped something that could have gone very wrong. I don't know if it was some kind of scam, or if the guy was testing something out on me without saying it. Maybe he was trying to see if I'd even notice he gave me the wrong thing. All I know is, the whole time I was there, he acted like he knew something I didn't, like he was waiting for me to do exactly what he wanted. And when I didn't, his whole demeanor shifted, like he had a plan that didn't go the way he expected. I ended up calling my doctor and telling him what happened. He seemed just as confused as I was and said it was a good thing I didn't take the pills. He told me to just come into the office and get a new prescription. I didn't mention the name of the town or the pharmacy because, to be honest, I wasn't even sure if I remembered the name right. It was just a blur after that. I just kept driving until I felt like I was far enough away from there. I still get a chill when I think about that guy's eyes, The way he stared at me like he was trying to figure out if I was going to play along or push back. And the way he held onto that bag, like he wasn't going to let me leave without it, still gets to me. I haven't stopped at a small town pharmacy since. I just don't trust them anymore. I was just passing through this small town on a weekend trip. I had some time to kill and spotted a little bookshop tucked between two old buildings. It had one of those withered signs swinging over the door, Townsend's Books, and the front window was crowded with dusty stacks of books and faded posters. It looked like the kind of place where you might find something interesting, a hidden gem or an old classic you've forgotten about. So, I went in, figuring I'd browse for a bit and maybe pick something up to read. Inside, it was dim, and it smelled like old paper and damp wood. The shelves were crammed close together, and there didn't seem to be much order to how things were arranged. There were books stacked sideways, some leaning against each other, and a couple that looked like they'd been shoved back in a hurry. It was quiet too, so quiet that I could hear my own footsteps on the creaky floorboards. I didn't see anyone behind the counter when I walked in, but a little bell over the door had jingled, so I figured someone must have noticed I'd come in. I started wandering through the aisles, looking at the spines of the books. Most of them didn't have any kind of organization, and some didn't even have titles on them, just blank covers. It was a bit strange, but I was curious, so I kept browsing. I must have been walking around for a good 10 minutes or so before I spotted a section in the very back, tucked away behind a tall shelf that seemed like it was almost meant to hide it. There was a handwritten sign over it that said "Private Collection." It wasn't big, just a small area with a few shelves and a narrow table. The books here were different. Some looked really old, with cracked leather covers and yellowed pages, but what caught my eye were these thin little booklets, almost like journals. They didn't have any titles on them, just scrawled writing on the front. I picked one up and flipped it open. The pages inside weren't printed, they were handwritten. The writing was messy and shaky, and it wasn't really stories or poems. It was more like thoughts or ramblings. A few sentences on one page would be about someone following the writer, then the next page would be about seeing strange shadows in the woods outside town. The more I read, the more it felt like the person who wrote it wasn't right in the head. I put it back and picked up another one. This one had more notes like that, except these talked about people in the town, describing them in weird ways, saying they were watchers or keepers. I didn't know what any of it meant, but it made my skin crawl, like I'd stumbled on something I wasn't supposed to see. Just then, I heard a floorboard creak behind me, and I turned around to see the shopkeeper standing there. He was an older guy, maybe in his late 60s, with white hair and a mustache that hung down past his lip. He had this thin frame, and his clothes looked old-fashioned, like he hadn't updated his wardrobe in decades. But the way he was looking at me, it was the way his eyes didn't blink, didn't move away. They were fixed on me in a way that made me feel pinned in place. "Find something interesting?" he asked. His voice was calm, too calm. I fumbled to put the little booklet back on the shelf and shook my head. "No, just browsing," I said, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out shakier than I meant it to. He took a step closer, and his eyes flicked to the booklets, then back to me. "Not many people go back there," he said. "That section's meant for the locals." "I didn't know," I said, starting to back away. "I was just curious." "Curiosity brought you here," he replied, taking another step. "Now you're part of it." I didn't like the way he said that, like there was some kind of hidden meaning behind the words. I took another step back, but he moved quicker than I thought an old man could, stepping right in front of me and blocking the way out of the little section. His thin frame didn't look like much, but there was something in his stance, the way he squared his shoulders, that told me I wasn't going to just push past him. I should be going, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't mean to. You don't leave, not now, he interrupted, his voice dropping lower. You've read what's in there. You're part of the community now. I didn't know what he was talking about, and I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I took a step back and tried to move to the side, but he reached out and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in harder than I thought he'd be able to. Let go, I said, trying to pull away, but his grip tightened. I felt a surge of panic then, like cold water pouring over me. The way he was holding onto me, it wasn't just a grip to keep me from moving, it felt like he was trying to drag me somewhere. I'll call the police, I said, louder this time, hoping to scare him off. Just let me go. He didn't let go, but I saw a flicker in his eyes, like something had shifted in him. His lips curled into a smile, and he said, "No need for that. You won't be needing a phone where you're going." That was it. I yanked my arm back as hard as I could and managed to break free from his grip. I didn't look back, I just ran straight for the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, and every step I took felt like it took a year to get me closer to the exit. I expected him to come after me, to grab me from behind and pull me back into that dark corner, but when I reached the door and shoved it open, he was still standing there, just watching me with that same smile. I sprinted to my car, fumbling for the keys in my pocket. My hands were shaking so much it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition, and the whole time I kept looking back at the shop. He was still standing there, just inside the door, watching me with that same blank stare. I finally got the car started and pulled out of the lot so fast I nearly ran off the road. I didn't stop driving until I was at least a few towns over. I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd somehow followed me, or that he'd put something on my car, but when I finally pulled over at a rest stop and got out to check, there was nothing. Just me, my car, and the empty road behind me. I don't know what that place was, or what he meant by community. I don't know if the things in those booklets were real or just the ramblings of someone unwell. But the way he looked at me, the way he said I was part of it now, it was like he was convinced that I'd crossed some kind of line, and there was no going back. I haven't been able to get the image of his face out of my head, or the feeling of his hand gripping my arm like he'd never let go. I don't know what he was planning to do, but I'm sure of one thing: I'm never setting foot in that town again. If you ever find yourself passing through, don't stop. Just keep driving. I was out of town for work, passing through this small place I'd never heard of before. Needed to grab some groceries for the week, so I stopped at the first store I found. It was this older-looking grocery store, not a chain, just a local place with faded signs and flickering lights in the parking lot. The kind of store that seemed like it had been there forever, but still wasn't too run down. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just there to get some basics and get back on the road. It was quiet inside, not many people around, just a couple of customers scattered through the aisles. I didn't notice anything strange at first. Just grabbed a basket and started going up and down the aisles, looking for what I needed. But a few minutes in, I started to feel like something was off. I kept seeing this guy, mid-40s, kind of scruffy looking, with a baseball cap pulled low over his face. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Figured he was just doing his shopping too. But then I noticed he'd end up in almost every aisle I was in, just a few feet away from me, always looking down at his phone or pretending to look at the shelves. I tried not to get paranoid, but it kept happening. I'd go to the next aisle, and a minute later, there he was again, just close enough that I could tell it wasn't a coincidence. I started picking up the pace, not even grabbing anything, just walking through each aisle to see if he'd follow. And he did. every single time. I stopped in the frozen foods section and tried to stay put, standing there for what felt like forever. I was staring at a row of TV dinners, waiting to see if he'd show up again. I was almost convincing myself it was just my imagination when I saw him step into the aisle. He didn't even pretend to shop this time, just stood at the far end, leaning on his cart, watching me. He had this strange little grin on his face, like he knew something I didn't. I turned and headed for the front of the store. I was done. I didn't even care if I didn't get everything I needed. I just wanted to get out. But as I walked up to the checkout lanes, I noticed the cashier, this young woman, was staring at me with wide eyes, like she was scared or something. There was no one else in line, so I went up to her, set my basket down, and tried to act normal. "I'm ready to check out," I said, but she didn't move. Just kept staring at me, her hand hovering over the register keys. Before I could say anything else, I heard a click behind me, and I turned to see one of the other employees, this older guy in a dirty apron, pulling down the metal gate over the entrance. He locked it with this big padlock and then turned to face me with this blank look, like he didn't even care that I saw him do it. I took a step back from the counter. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, but I could hear it shaking. Nobody answered. The girl behind the register just kept looking at me with this frightened expression, and the older guy stood there like he was waiting for something. Then I saw the man with the baseball cap again. He was standing at the end of the last checkout lane, leaning against the wall, still with that little grin. He started walking toward me, slow and steady, like he wasn't in any hurry. I backed up even more, knocking my basket over. The groceries spilled out, but I didn't care. I was looking for another way out. There was a side door by the produce section, the kind that employees probably used. I bolted for it, but as I got close, I saw another guy in an apron come out of the stockroom and block the door, crossing his arms and giving me this blank stare, just like the other one. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding, and my throat felt tight. It didn't make any sense. It was just a grocery store, but it was like they had all decided I wasn't leaving. I turned back toward the checkout lanes, and the guy with the cap was still coming toward me, still at that same slow pace. I tried to reason with him, even though I didn't know what I was reasoning against. "What do you want?" I yelled, looking from the cashier to the older man. "Why won't you let me leave?" Nobody said anything. The only sound was the soft squeak of the guy's shoes as he got closer. I grabbed a can from a nearby display and threw it toward him, not even really aiming, just trying to make him stop. It clattered to the floor, and he paused, just for a second, then kept walking. I glanced back at the other side door, the one near the frozen foods. It was my last chance. I sprinted for it, not caring who got in my way. The older guy moved to block me again, but I pushed past him, hard, and managed to reach the door. I hit the metal bar with my shoulder, and it flew open with a loud clang. I was outside. I didn't stop to see if they were coming after me. I just ran. I ran past the parking lot and into the street, not even thinking about my car, just needing to get away from that place. I didn't look back until I was a few blocks away, standing in front of some rundown diner, gasping for breath. The street was quiet. No one had followed me. I waited there for a while, just trying to calm down, but my heart wouldn't stop racing. I didn't know what that was, what they had wanted, or why they'd locked me in. I felt like I'd stepped into some kind of trap, but I didn't know what for. Eventually, I walked back to where I'd parked my car. It was still there, nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept looking around, expecting to see one of them, the man in the baseball cap or one of the employees, just standing there, watching me again. But there was no one. I got in my car and drove out of that town as fast as I could. I don't know what was going on in that grocery store or why they did what they did. But the way they looked at me, the way they acted like it was all just normal to them, it was like they'd done this before. Like it was just a matter of time before someone else came through, and they'd do it all over again. I still get this sinking feeling in my gut when I think about it, especially the way that guy smiled at me, like he was already sure how it was going to end. I haven't been back that way since, and I don't think I ever will. I was driving through this small town I'd never been to before. I wasn't planning on staying or anything, just passing through, but I saw this little church and felt like I should stop. I'd been going through a rough time, just needed some quiet or something familiar, I guess. The church wasn't big or fancy, just an old building with a sign out front that said Sunday service. It was starting soon, so I figured I'd go in. There weren't many cars in the lot, but I thought maybe it was just a small congregation. When I stepped inside, the place was quiet, almost too quiet. I'd expected to hear some music or people talking, but there was nothing. Just the sound of my shoes on the wooden floor. The whole church had this dim lighting, and the air smelled kind of stale, like it hadn't been aired out in a while. I saw about 15 or 20 people sitting in the pews, spread out, not really talking to each other. Nobody even looked up when I came in. I walked down the aisle and took a seat near the back, figured I'd just stay for a bit and then leave if I didn't feel comfortable. But then I started noticing the way people were acting. They weren't really praying or talking, just sitting there, staring straight ahead. I kept glancing around, trying to catch someone's eye or give a little nod like you do, but every time I looked at someone, they'd just look away real fast. It felt weird, like they were purposely ignoring me. I thought about leaving right then, but the service was about to start, and I figured I'd just sit through a bit of it before heading out. When the pastor came out, he didn't really seem like any pastor I'd ever seen before. He didn't have the kind of welcoming look you'd expect. He was tall, thin, had this worn-out black suit on, and his face was pale, with these deep-set eyes that made it look like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't smile or greet the congregation, just stood up at the pulpit and started talking in this flat voice. There was no opening hymn or prayer, just him speaking. He was saying something about devotion, but it wasn't like any sermon I'd heard before. It felt off, like the words didn't fit right. It was hard to explain. He'd keep pausing, looking around the room like he was making sure everyone was paying attention. Every time he did, I felt this uneasy feeling in my stomach, like I shouldn't have come there at all. After about 10 minutes, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up quietly and started to walk toward the back. But before I could reach the doors, I noticed two men standing on either side of the exit. They hadn't been there when I came in, I was sure of it. They were big guys, both wearing these dark suits that looked almost identical. They were just standing there, staring straight ahead, but I could tell they were watching me. I tried to act casual and walked a little slower, not wanting to draw any attention to myself, but just as I was a few feet away from the doors, I heard the pastor's voice echo through the room. "Where are you going?" he asked. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence in a way that made everyone turn and look at me. I froze, not sure what to say. I was just stepping out for a moment, I replied, my voice sounding shaky even to me. The pastor didn't say anything else, but I noticed that everyone in the pews was now looking at me. Their expressions didn't look concerned or curious, they looked blank, like they were waiting for something. I took another step toward the door, but the two men moved closer, just enough that I knew they weren't going to let me through. I looked back toward the pastor, and he was just staring at me with that same flat expression, like he was studying me. "I think I need to leave," I said, louder this time, but nobody moved or said a word. It was like I was trapped in some kind of strange theater where everyone knew the script but me. The pastor took a step down from the pulpit, slowly walking toward me, his shoes clicking against the floor. "You should stay," he said. "We haven't even gotten to the important part yet." My heart was racing now. I glanced at the windows, thinking maybe I could get out that way, but they were high up and had thick glass. There wasn't a chance I could break through. I took another step back, and the two men at the door stepped closer, blocking my path completely. I was starting to panic, and I didn't care if it showed. "Let me out," I said, my voice breaking a little. "I'm not staying here." Nobody answered. The pastor stopped walking and just stood there, watching me, his head tilted slightly like he was amused or something. I didn't know what else to do, so I turned and ran up the aisle, trying to get to a side door I'd seen near the front. But as I reached for the handle, I felt someone grab my arm. I looked back, and one of the men in the suits had a tight grip on me, his face still expressionless. I pulled away as hard as I could and managed to break free, stumbling back into the aisle. The other people were starting to stand up now, moving slowly like they weren't in any hurry. They weren't saying anything, just closing in on me from all sides. I bolted toward the other side of the room, where there was another door. I didn't know where it led, but it was my only shot. I reached it and shoved it open, running into a narrow hallway lined with old wooden doors. It looked like some kind of storage area or offices. I didn't care. I just kept running, trying to find an exit. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. I didn't stop to see who it was, just ran faster, shoving open doors as I went, hoping one would lead outside. Most of them were just closets or small rooms, but finally, I found one that led to a back stairwell. I took the steps two at a time, almost tripping over myself, and when I got to the bottom, I saw a door leading outside. I pushed it open and stumbled out into the daylight, gasping for air like I'd been underwater. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling for my keys with shaking hands. I got in and locked the doors, looking back at the church. The pastor was standing in the doorway, just watching me. He didn't come after me, didn't say anything, just stood there with that same blank expression. There were a few other people behind him, standing just inside the door, but none of them came outside. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I started the car and sped out of there, my heart still pounding in my chest. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't gotten out, but the way they looked at me, it was like they were all waiting for something, like I was supposed to be part of it, whatever it was. I still don't understand what was going on in there, and I'm not sure I ever want to know. All I know is that wasn't a church service. At least, not the kind I've ever been to. And whatever they were planning, I'm just glad I didn't stick around to find out. I was 17 when it happened. I was driving back from a friend's place, and it was late, later than I should have been out. The route took me through a small town I didn't know too well, but I figured it was no big deal since I'd passed through before, and I'd be home in about an hour. I was on this stretch of road, just fields on either side, when the car started making this knocking noise from the engine. I hoped it would go away, but it just kept getting louder, and then the temperature gauge shot up. I didn't know much about cars, but I knew enough to pull over before I ended up stranded in the middle of nowhere. I managed to limp into a small gas station that had an old garage attached. The kind you don't see much of anymore, with a little office and a couple of service bays that looked like they hadn't seen a new car in years. The mechanic was an older guy, maybe in his 50s or 60s, wearing a stained jumpsuit. He had a kind of rough look, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I told him what was going on with the car, and he said he'd take a look at it. I watched him poke around under the hood, tapping a few things and muttering to himself. After a few minutes, he came back over and said it wasn't good. He told me the radiator was leaking, and the engine might have been close to overheating. Said he could fix it, but he didn't have the right parts on hand. I'd have to leave the car overnight, and he'd order what he needed first thing in the morning. He must have noticed the look on my face because he said not to worry, he could give me a ride home. I hesitated, but he assured me it wasn't far, and I didn't see any other options since I didn't know anyone nearby. I agreed, and he went back into the shop for a bit, told me to wait in his truck. It was this old, beat-up pickup with tools and junk scattered all over the floor. The passenger seat was worn down, and it smelled like oil and cigarettes. I was nervous, but I figured it was just because I wasn't used to this kind of thing, and I'd be home soon enough. When he got in, he didn't start the truck right away. He just sat there for a moment, looking straight ahead like he was thinking about something. Then he turned to me and asked if I'd ever been through this town before. I told him I'd passed through, but I didn't know it well. He nodded and said something about how not many people come by anymore, except for when they're lost or just passing through. We pulled out of the garage, and for the first few minutes, it was just a normal drive. He was quiet, and I didn't have much to say either. I was looking out the window, trying to recognize any landmarks, but everything looked the same, just dark streets and houses with the lights off. That's when I noticed we were heading in the opposite direction from where I thought we should be going. I think my place is back that way, I said, pointing over my shoulder. He glanced at me, just a quick look, and then back at the road. This way's quicker, he said, his voice flat. Trust me, kid, I've lived here a long time. I didn't know what else to say, but something about the way he answered didn't sit right with me. We kept driving, and the streets got narrower, fewer streetlights. It was like we were heading out of town, not through it. I felt my hands getting sweaty, and I shifted in my seat. I wanted to ask him again, but I was afraid of sounding like a scared little kid. Then he started talking, real casual, like he was just making conversation. You know, there's a lot of places out here folks don't know about, he said. Old roads, old buildings. Things change slower in these parts. I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded, even though he wasn't looking at me. I kept glancing at the dashboard, trying to see if I could recognize any signs or anything, but it was just dark and empty out there. He kept talking, going on about the history of the town, but his tone had this edge to it. It wasn't friendly, it was more like he was trying to fill the silence or keep me from asking questions. We drove for another 10 minutes, maybe more, and the houses were gone by then. It was just fields and trees on either side of the road. I knew something was wrong. I wasn't sure how far we were from anywhere, but I had to say something. I cleared my throat and spoke up, trying to sound calm. Are we almost there? I don't really recognize this area. He didn't answer right away. Just kept his eyes on the road, one hand gripping the wheel tighter. Then he gave this little laugh, but it didn't sound like he thought anything was funny. Almost, he said. Not much further now. My chest felt tight, and I was trying not to panic. I reached for my phone in my pocket, hoping maybe I could call someone, but when I pulled it out, I saw I didn't have any signal. I tried to act like I was just checking the time, not wanting him to notice I was nervous. We took a sharp turn onto a dirt road, and that's when I decided I had to do something. I told him I needed to get out, that I'd walk the rest of the way. I reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't open. I kept pulling on it, but it was stuck or locked or something. Sit tight, he said, his voice lower than before. It's safer if you just sit tight. I looked at him, and for the first time, he turned and looked right back at me. There was something in his eyes, a kind of coldness that sent a chill down my spine. I knew right then that I had to get out, no matter what. I started fiddling with the lock, trying to pull it up, but he reached over and grabbed my arm, squeezing it hard. "Calm down," he said, his grip tightening. "I'm just trying to help." I yanked my arm away and kicked at the door as hard as I could. It didn't budge, but I didn't stop. I kept kicking and trying to push the window down. The truck started to slow, and I knew he was going to stop and try to pull me back if I didn't get out right then. As the truck came to a crawl, I saw a patch of woods to the right and decided it was my only shot. I leaned back, pulled my legs up, and kicked at the window with everything I had. It cracked, but didn't break. I kicked again, harder this time, and the glass shattered. I shoved myself through the broken window, feeling the shards scrape against my arms, and tumbled out onto the dirt. I hit the ground hard, but I didn't wait to catch my breath. I got up and ran for the trees, not looking back. I could hear the truck's engine still running and then the sound of the door opening, but I didn't stop. I ran into the woods, the branches whipping in my face, stumbling over roots and rocks. I kept going until I couldn't hear the truck anymore, just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of leaves under my feet. I didn't know where I was going, but I wasn't going to stop until I found a road or a house, somewhere with people. After what felt like forever, I saw lights through the trees and came out onto a small road. I flagged down the first car I saw, a woman who thankfully stopped and let me in. I told her what happened, and she took me to the nearest police station. I filed a report, but they never found the guy. The shop was there, but the owner said he hadn't worked there for years. He'd disappeared a while back, and no one knew where he'd gone. They searched around, but it was like he just vanished. I never found out what he really wanted or what he was planning to do. But I still think about it sometimes, the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up for something. It's been years now, and I still don't like driving through small towns or stopping at places I don't know. I don't think I ever will. I'd rented a small cabin for a few days, just to get away from everything. It was off a quiet road on the outskirts of a small town, nothing fancy, but it was supposed to be peaceful. I'd been there 2 nights when I woke up to the sound of glass breaking downstairs. It was just a little past midnight. I sat up, heart racing, listening for any other sounds, trying to make sense of it. There were footsteps and the creak of the floorboards. I grabbed my phone and called 911 right away. I whispered to the operator, saying there was someone in my cabin and they needed to send someone quick. The operator told me to stay calm and stay on the line while they dispatched an officer. I crept over to the bedroom door and quietly locked it. I didn't have anything to defend myself with, so I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a metal floor lamp. I stood there, barely breathing, clutching the lamp in both hands, and listened. After a couple of minutes, I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore, just the hum of the refrigerator downstairs. I didn't know if they'd left or if they were just waiting quietly, like me. I stayed in the room until I saw the blue and red lights flashing through the window. I made my way downstairs, still holding the lamp, and went outside. 2 officers were standing by the patrol car, and I told them what had happened. They walked inside, had a quick look around, and said there was no sign of anyone. One of the officers, he was older, with thinning hair, asked if anything was missing. I said I didn't think so, but it was hard to tell since I didn't bring much. Then I showed him where the window had been broken. He looked at it for a second, then turned back to me and asked if I'd been drinking that night. I said no, I hadn't. I was just sleeping when it happened. The other officer, a younger guy with dark hair, leaned in a little closer and asked if I'd been alone the whole time I was at the cabin. His tone wasn't right. It didn't sound like a normal question. I told him yes, I'd been alone, and he just stared at me for a moment before glancing over at the older officer. There was this look they shared, like they knew something I didn't. The older officer told me they'd do a patrol around the area and see if anyone else had reported anything, but he said it in a way that didn't sound like he thought it was necessary. I asked if I should file a report or something, but he shook his head and said it didn't seem like there was much to report since nothing was missing and there was no sign of an intruder. I didn't understand why they weren't taking it more seriously. I mean, the window was broken, and I'd heard footsteps. It wasn't nothing. But they just kept saying there wasn't much they could do. Before I went back inside, the younger officer asked if I was staying in town long. I said I had a few more days, and he told me to be careful and to lock the doors at night. He said it in this strange way, like he was giving advice to someone who didn't know any better. I nodded, not sure how to take it, and went back inside. The next morning, I drove into town to the police station, thinking maybe if I went in person, they'd take it more seriously. The station was small, not very busy, and when I went up to the front desk, a woman behind the counter looked up at me with a kind of blank expression. I told her I needed to report a break-in at the cabin I was renting. She asked for my name and where I was staying, and I gave her the details. Then she just looked at me for a moment, like she was waiting for me to say something else. I explained again about the broken window and how I'd heard someone inside. She sighed, like she was annoyed, and said they'd already sent officers out last night and nothing was found. I said I knew that, but I thought there should still be a report filed. She stared at me a bit longer before picking up a phone and calling someone from the back. A minute later, the two officers from the night before came out. The younger one gave me this strange half-smile when he saw me, but it didn't feel friendly. The older officer asked me again if I was sure I hadn't been drinking, and I said yes, I was sure. I could feel my frustration building, and I asked why they kept bringing that up. Did they think I imagined the whole thing? The older officer stepped closer, leaning on the counter between us. We get a lot of people coming through this town, he said, especially folks who aren't used to the quiet. Sometimes, they start hearing things that aren't really there. I told him that I knew what I'd heard. I wasn't some city person who'd never been outside before. There were footsteps in the cabin, and the window didn't break itself. The younger officer chimed in, saying it was probably just an animal, and maybe I'd startled myself when I heard the noise. I was getting nowhere with them, and I started to turn to leave when the older officer spoke up again, his voice lower. If I were you, I'd think real hard about sticking around here, he said. We don't usually have trouble in this town, and we don't want to start. It didn't make any sense. It almost sounded like a threat, but I couldn't tell why they'd say something like that. I tried to shake it off, thinking maybe I'd misread the tone or something. But as I walked out of the station, I couldn't help but feel like there was something wrong about the way they talked to me. Like they knew something they weren't saying. I went back to the cabin and spent the day trying to distract myself. I went for a walk by the lake, sat on the porch with a book, but I kept thinking about what had happened. That evening, I decided I didn't want to stay another night. I was going to pack up and leave early the next morning. Around 9 o'clock, I was sitting in the living room, going through some things, when I heard a car pull up outside. I looked through the window and saw a police car parked out front. The older officer was standing by the car, and the younger one was walking up to the door. I opened it before he could knock. He told me they'd just come by to make sure everything was all right. He said they had a few reports of suspicious activity in the area. The way he said it made my skin crawl, like he was trying to sound reassuring but didn't quite pull it off. I told him everything was fine, but I'd be leaving in the morning. The older officer, who had stayed by the car, called out, "You should reconsider that." I looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" He just shook his head. "Some places, people are better off staying put. Things happen on the road out here." That was enough for me. I told them I was fine and went back inside. I locked the door and double-checked all the windows. Then I went upstairs and packed my things as quietly as I could, feeling this urgency to get out right then and there. I didn't sleep that night. I kept listening for any sound outside, waiting for the first light of morning. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I grabbed my bags, threw them in the car, and took off. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on a main highway, surrounded by other cars and normal people. I still don't know what they were trying to do or what was really going on. But there was something about the way they talked to me, the way they acted, that made me feel like I was a problem they needed to keep an eye on. I've thought about it a lot, and I still don't have any answers. But I know one thing, I'll never go back to that town, and I'll never rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere again. I was driving through this little town, just passing through on a road trip, when I saw a roadside fruit stand up ahead. It was one of those wooden stalls, painted white but chipped and faded like it had been there forever. There were a few crates of apples, peaches, and some jars of honey lined up on a table. I figured it was as good a place as any to take a break and pick up some snacks for the road, so I pulled over and parked on the shoulder. As I got out of the car, I noticed the woman running the stand. She was an older lady, probably in her 70s, with thin gray hair tied back in a bun. She wore a loose dress that hung off her, and there was a faded apron over it. Her skin was wrinkled, but she had these sharp eyes, and she was watching me closely as I walked up. I gave her a polite nod and started looking at the apples, trying to figure out which ones looked good. "You like peaches?" she asked, her voice kind of raspy, but with this strange cheerfulness that didn't fit her face. I said, "Sure, I like peaches," and she immediately picked one up and handed it to me. "Here, taste it. The best around, I promise." I wasn't that interested in eating it right then, so I just thanked her and took it, figuring I'd add it to whatever else I was going to buy. I asked her how much for the apples and a jar of honey. She didn't answer right away, just kept looking at me like she was sizing me up. "You must be new in town," she said. I told her I was just passing through, trying to keep it light. I wasn't looking to get into a conversation, I just wanted to pay and leave. But then she leaned in a bit, still smiling, and said, "You should come by for lunch. I've got a stew on the stove, fresh bread too." I was a little caught off guard by that, and I told her thanks, but I was just going to grab a few things and keep driving. She didn't take the hint. She kept insisting, saying how it'd be no trouble at all, that it was just down the road and I'd be doing her a favor because she didn't get company much. Her voice was friendly, but there was something underneath it, like she wasn't asking so much as telling me I should come. I kept politely refusing, trying to wrap things up by pulling out my wallet and asking how much I owed. That's when her smile faded, and her eyes got even sharper, almost like she was angry that I wasn't agreeing. She put the peach back in the crate without breaking eye contact and said, "You're being rude, you know." It didn't sound like a joke. I gave her an uneasy chuckle, like trying to laugh it off, and told her I didn't mean to be rude, I was just on a schedule. I started to walk back to my car, but before I could get the door open, she was right behind me, closer than she'd been before. She grabbed my arm, not hard, but just enough to stop me from moving. "I'm not asking," she said quietly, almost like she was talking to herself. Her hand was bony and cold, and I pulled my arm away as gently as I could, telling her I really had to get going. She just stood there, staring at me, not blinking. I got into the car and shut the door, locking it right away. She didn't move from where she was standing, just kept watching me with that same look, and I could see her lips moving, like she was mumbling something I couldn't hear. I started the car and pulled away, trying not to look back. But when I glanced in the rearview mirror, she was still there, watching the car as I drove off. I kept driving for a few miles, trying to shake off the weird feeling. I didn't know why she'd gotten so insistent, but I figured it was just some lonely old lady who didn't know when to take no for an answer. I tried to put it out of my head and focus on the road. But about 10 minutes later, as I was passing through another small patch of town, I saw something that made my stomach tighten. There was a rusty old truck behind me, not too close, but following steadily. It had appeared out of nowhere, and I hadn't seen it when I pulled out from the fruit stand. The more I drove, the more certain I was that it was the same truck that had been parked near the stand, the one I'd noticed without really paying attention to. Now it seemed like it was keeping pace with me, no matter how many turns I made. I decided to test it, just to be sure. I took a random left onto a narrow side street, then a quick right, circling back toward the main road. The truck stayed behind me, matching every turn. My heart was thudding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the thought that the old woman was behind the wheel, chasing after me for some reason I didn't want to know. I sped up a bit, not too much, just enough to put some distance between us. I didn't want to look like I was panicking, but when I glanced in the mirror again, the truck was closing the gap. That's when I realized it wasn't just following me. It was speeding up too. I saw a gas station up ahead and decided to pull in, thinking maybe if I was around other people, she'd give up and go away. I parked next to the pump and watched as the truck pulled in too, stopping a few spaces down. I could see the figure in the driver's seat now, and it was her. She was sitting there, gripping the steering wheel, her head turned slightly toward me but not getting out. I went inside the station, pretending I needed something. I walked around for a few minutes, keeping an eye on the truck through the window. She didn't move, just kept sitting there, watching the entrance. I wasn't sure what to do. I didn't want to go back outside while she was still there, but I couldn't stay in the gas station forever. Eventually, I decided to go out the back door and circle around to my car from the other side. I figured I could get in and drive off before she realized what I was doing. As I came out from behind the building, though, I saw her. She had gotten out of the truck and was walking slowly toward my car, looking at it like she was inspecting it. I froze for a second, not knowing if I should shout or run or just keep quiet. She hadn't seen me yet, so I ducked back behind the building, peeking around the corner to watch her. She reached out and touched the door handle of my car, pulling on it, even though it was locked. Then she walked around to the back and did the same with the trunk. I couldn't stay hidden anymore. I stepped out and yelled at her, asking what the hell she was doing. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and angry, like I'd just caught her in the middle of something she didn't want anyone to see. "You're being difficult," she said, almost shouting. I only wanted to have lunch. There was this edge to her voice, not desperation but something darker, like she was mad I'd made her follow me this far. I told her to get away from my car and that I was going to call the police if she didn't leave. She just stared at me, not moving. I pulled my phone out, making sure she saw it, and started dialing. As soon as I did, she turned and walked back to her truck, not in a hurry, but calmly, like she wasn't worried at all. She got inside and drove off, heading back the way we'd come. I didn't wait around. I jumped into my car and sped out of there, not even stopping to think about which direction I was going. I just wanted to get as far away from that town as I could. I kept checking the mirror for a long time after, expecting to see her old truck again, but I didn't. I drove for hours, barely stopping, just trying to put as much distance between me and that place as I could. I still don't know what she really wanted or why she wouldn't let it go. Maybe it was just some crazy person who'd fixated on me for no reason. But the way she followed me, the way she spoke, it was like she wasn't just asking for lunch. It felt like she was looking for something else, and I was lucky I didn't find out what. I had been thinking about getting a dog for a while. I always imagined it would be a joyful experience. So, one Saturday morning, I drove out to a small town animal shelter that I had heard good things about. The shelter was modest, just a single-story building with a faded sign. Inside, it smelled like cleaning supplies mixed with the faint odor of dog food. I wandered through the rows of kennels, listening to the soft whines and barks. That's when I saw her. She was a medium-sized mutt with big brown eyes, and she was sitting quietly in the back of her kennel. Her fur was a mix of brown and black, and she had scars on her legs that made my heart ache. I leaned down, and she came to me, pressing her nose against the bars. I felt an immediate connection, and after talking to a staff member, I decided to adopt her. The woman who helped me was friendly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me too closely. She smiled too wide, like there was something she wanted to say but didn't. I pushed it aside, excited to take my new companion home. I named her Bella. The first few days with Bella were wonderful. She was sweet and playful, and it felt like she was already a part of my life. But something started to change when I began to notice her scars more often. They looked old, like they had healed long before I met her, but I couldn't help but wonder how she got them. A few days later, I decided to go back to the shelter to ask the staff about Bella's past. I thought it would be a simple question. I walked into the shelter, greeted by the familiar smell. But when I approached the front desk, the woman who had helped me before was gone. Instead, a man stood behind the counter. He looked up as I approached and smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone cheerful but a bit too forced. I told him I wanted to know more about Bella's background. I explained I noticed the scars on her legs, and I was curious about what had happened. His smile faded slightly, and he leaned back in his chair. "Bella is a sweet dog," he said, avoiding my gaze. "She had a rough start, but she is safe now." "Rough start?" I asked, sensing the tension in the air. "What do you mean?" He shifted uncomfortably and cleared his throat. "Some dogs come from tough situations. But she's here now, and that is what matters." I pressed further. "But what happened to her? Did she come from an abusive home?" At that moment, I felt a chill creep over me as if I were being watched. I turned to look behind me, but the lobby was empty. The man behind the desk was now leaning forward, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe you should take it easy," he said. "She is safe here, and that is all you need to know." I could feel my heart racing. There was something off about how he spoke. I decided it was time to leave, but as I turned to walk away, I noticed a woman standing at the entrance of the shelter. She had an unkempt appearance, her hair tangled, and her clothes were stained. She looked at me with wide, frantic eyes, as if she had just run in from the street. "Don't let them keep her," she shouted. "They are not what they seem." I was startled, and the man at the desk immediately stood up, his demeanor shifting. "Ma'am, please." "You need to leave," he said firmly. But the woman rushed past him, her eyes fixed on me. "They do bad things to the dogs. You must take her away. They hurt her." My heart raced as I processed what she said. The man stepped closer, his expression cold and threatening. "You need to ignore her. She is not stable," he insisted. I glanced between the two of them, fear flooding my chest. "What is going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The woman turned to me, desperation in her eyes. "You have to listen. They hurt the dogs here. Bella is not safe." Before I could respond, the man reached for the phone behind the desk, his eyes never leaving mine. "You need to leave now. This is private property," he said, his voice calm but dangerous. I felt trapped. I couldn't let them take Bella from me, but I couldn't ignore what the woman said either. I backed away slowly, but the man stepped forward, blocking my exit. "Please, just go home. Take care of your dog," he urged, his smile returning but looking even more sinister. I was terrified. I could feel the tension in the air, and I knew I had to get out. I glanced at the woman, but she seemed lost, caught in her own fear. I turned and pushed my way through the door, rushing outside. My heart pounded in my chest, and I glanced back to see the man standing in the doorway, watching me with a look that sent chills down my spine. I hurried to my car, fumbling with my keys as I tried to catch my breath. I drove home in a daze, my mind racing with questions. Had Bella been abused? What had that woman meant about the shelter? Once home, I took a moment to calm down. I sat on the couch, Bella curled up beside me. I ran my fingers through her fur, feeling the scars under my touch. I resolved to protect her at all costs. I couldn't let anyone hurt her again. The next day, I called a veterinarian to get Bella checked out. I needed to know if there was anything wrong. When I explained Bella's background, the vet agreed to see her that afternoon. As we waited in the examination room, I kept looking at Bella, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The vet came in, examining her gently. He noted the scars and asked about them, but I couldn't tell him much. He looked concerned as he examined her closely. "I need to check something," he said after a moment. He stepped out of the room, and I sat there with Bella, rubbing her ears and trying to reassure her. When the vet returned, he had a serious look on his face. "I need to talk to you about Bella's scars," he began. "Some of them look like they could be from abuse or neglect." I felt my stomach drop. "Abuse?" I whispered. "Yes. It is possible she has been mistreated," he said, his voice gentle. "But we can work with her. It may take time, but with the right care and training, she can learn to trust again." That's when it hit me. The shelter had known what had happened to Bella, and they didn't want to talk about it. They were hiding something. I left the vet's office with a plan. I would find out the truth. Over the next few days, I researched the shelter. I found local news articles mentioning complaints about their treatment of animals. It seemed I wasn't the only one concerned. I gathered everything I could find and prepared to confront the shelter staff. When I returned, I was ready. I walked in, and the same man was behind the desk. I felt a surge of determination. "I want to speak to the manager," I said firmly. He gave me a tight smile. "What seems to be the problem?" I pulled out my papers, my voice steady. "I know about the complaints against this shelter. I want answers about Bella. You will tell me what happened to her." His expression darkened, and he stood up slowly. "You need to leave. This is a private facility." I stood my ground. "I won't leave until you tell me what you did to those dogs." At that moment, the woman from before appeared again, looking more composed this time. "Please, you have to listen to her. They will not let you go. You have to take your dog and leave." I turned to her, feeling the weight of her words. I knew she was right. I needed to protect Bella. I backed away, ready to leave. "You can't hide this forever," I called over my shoulder as I headed for the door. As I stepped outside, I could hear the man yelling behind me, but I didn't turn back. I rushed to my car, and my heart raced as I drove away. I had Bella, and that was all that mattered. From that day on, I focused on Bella's care and training. She slowly started to heal, and the scars became a part of her story, not the end of it. I often thought about what happened at that shelter and how close I had come to losing her. I couldn't shake the feeling that there were others like her still trapped there, but for now, I had Bella, and I would do everything to make sure she felt safe and loved. I decided to take a weekend getaway to a cabin in the woods. I packed my bags and made a list of supplies I needed for the trip. The drive was long, but the scenery was beautiful, filled with tall trees and open skies. After a few hours on the road, I came across a small town. It looked charming and quaint, so I thought I would stop at the general store to pick up some last-minute supplies. The store was small, with wooden beams and a creaky door that opened with a slight push. Inside, it was dimly lit, with shelves full of various goods, canned foods, snacks, and outdoor supplies. An older man stood behind the counter. He wore a worn-out apron and had gray hair that fell messily over his forehead. He looked up as I entered, offering a polite nod. I walked down the aisles, gathering what I needed: some canned soup, snacks, bottled water, and a few other essentials for my retreat. As I moved to the back of the store, I noticed a section filled with camping gear. There were flashlights, rope, and some other items that looked useful. I picked up a sturdy flashlight, thinking it would be good to have in case the power went out at the cabin. When I brought my items to the counter, the man's expression changed. He eyed the flashlight and frowned. "You can't buy that," he said, his voice low and gravelly. I paused, surprised. "Why not?" "I need it for my trip." "That flashlight belongs to the town," he insisted, his tone firm. "It's not for sale." I looked around, confused. "What do you mean it belongs to the town?" "It's just a flashlight." "It's part of a community supply," he replied, crossing his arms. "You can't take it." I could feel irritation rising in me. "I'm sure you have others. Just sell me this one." The man shook his head. "I can't sell you that. It's not allowed." My patience wore thin. "Look, I'm just trying to buy some supplies for my trip. If it's a community supply, then let me know how I can pay for it. I'll contribute." He leaned closer to the counter, lowering his voice. "You don't understand. This is not for outsiders. You are not from here." I took a step back, my heart racing. "I'm just here for the weekend. I'm not trying to cause trouble." He leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "You should leave what you have chosen. It is better that way." I felt a wave of unease wash over me. Something about his demeanor felt off, and I could sense that he was serious. "I'll take the other items, then. Just let me have the flashlight." He shook his head again, his expression unyielding. "I told you, you cannot have it." I glanced at the items on the counter, then back at the flashlight. The longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I felt. I picked up the flashlight, determined to leave with it. "I'll be taking this. I don't see why I can't have it." The man's face darkened, and he straightened up. "You need to put that down. This is not a game." "I'm not putting it down," I said, my voice rising. "I'm a paying customer. You can't refuse to sell me something." He leaned over the counter, his eyes wild. "You don't know what you're doing. You need to leave those items and go." I felt the tension in the air thicken. I could sense that things were escalating quickly, and my instincts kicked in. I took a step back, clutching the flashlight tightly. "I am leaving, and I am taking this with me." As I turned to walk out of the store, I heard the man yell behind me. "You cannot leave with that. You are not welcome here." Ignoring him, I pushed through the door, my heart pounding. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped outside. The warm sun hit my face, but my mind was racing. I glanced back, half expecting him to come storming out after me. Instead, he stood at the entrance, a furious expression on his face. "You need to come back. You cannot take what belongs to us." I felt a surge of adrenaline. I hurried to my car, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I could hear him shouting, but I didn't turn around. I got into the car and locked the doors, my heart racing. I could still see him standing there, his arms crossed, a look of pure anger on his face. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, glancing in the rearview mirror. The store was still there, the old man now a small figure in the distance. I could feel the weight of his stare as I drove away. As I got back on the main road, I felt a mix of fear and relief wash over me. I continued my drive to the cabin, my thoughts racing. I wondered if I had just made a mistake, if I should have left a flashlight behind. The memory of the man's angry face lingered in my mind. I shook it off, reminding myself that I was only trying to prepare for my weekend away. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked and took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. The surroundings were peaceful, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me as I unloaded my supplies. I set the flashlight on the table, noticing how sturdy it felt in my hands. I was glad I had it. As evening fell, I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled in. The flickering flames cast shadows on the walls, creating a cozy atmosphere. I opened a can of soup and warmed it on the stove, feeling a sense of comfort envelop me. I was finally able to relax. But then, as I sat there, the events from the store crept back into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had upset something in that small town. I glanced out the window, the darkness enveloping the woods around me. I imagined the old man pacing the store, telling others about me, about how I had taken something from them. That night, I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing sounds outside. The rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a branch made my heart race. I told myself it was just wildlife, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I felt the tension in the air, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. In the morning, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, the sun filtering through the trees. The forest was beautiful, but the unease lingered in my mind. I tried to enjoy the scenery, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to be cautious. After a while, I came across a small stream. The water flowed gently, and I sat on a rock, trying to relax. As I took in the surroundings, I noticed movement in the distance. A figure emerged from the trees, and my heart dropped. It was the old man from the store. He was walking slowly, his face set in a grim expression. I quickly stood up, feeling the flashlight in my hand. I didn't want to confront him again, but I didn't want to seem scared either. I took a deep breath and decided to stay put, hoping he would pass by. But he didn't. He stopped and stared at me from a distance, his eyes locked onto mine. The tension from the store flooded back, and I felt my heart race. He shouted something I couldn't hear, but the anger in his voice was clear. I glanced around, searching for a way out, but the path behind me led further into the woods. "Get back to where you belong," he yelled, his voice echoing through the trees. I turned to run, but I tripped over a root and fell to the ground, the flashlight rolling away from me. I scrambled to my feet, but he was already closer, his footsteps heavy on the ground. Panic surged through me as I grabbed the flashlight and turned to face him. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my voice trembling. He stopped a few feet away, his expression fierce. "You don't understand what you have done. You are not welcome here." I raised the flashlight defensively, feeling the weight of it in my hand. "I don't want any trouble. I'm just trying to enjoy my weekend." He took another step forward, his anger palpable. You think you can take from us? You think you can just walk in and take what belongs to the town? I was terrified. I felt trapped, but I couldn't back down. I'll leave. Just let me go. He hesitated, his eyes flickering with something, maybe doubt, maybe something more dangerous. I could sense that this was my moment. I took a deep breath and swung the flashlight toward him, not with the intent to hit, but to show I wasn't afraid. Back off. I yelled, and to my surprise, it seemed to work. He paused, his expression shifting, as if he was weighing his options. After a tense moment, he stepped back. You should not have taken that flashlight, he muttered, but his voice was less aggressive now. I seized the opportunity and turned to run. I dashed down the path, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear him yelling behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran as fast as I could, pushing through the trees and branches until I reached my car. I jumped inside and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I started the engine and tore out of there, my heart racing. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him chasing after me, but there was nothing. Just the road stretching behind me. As I drove away, I felt a mix of fear and relief wash over me. I had escaped, but the memory of that confrontation lingered. I realized that I had stumbled into something much darker than I had anticipated. It was a small town with its own rules and hidden dangers. The flashlight sat on the passenger seat, and I couldn't help but think about what it represented, a confrontation with something I did not fully understand. I would never go back there. The woods were beautiful, but they held secrets I was not ready to uncover. As I drove away, I felt the weight of the town lift off my shoulders, knowing I had made it out safely. I had been living in the small town for a few months when I noticed something unsettling. It began with strange noises in the middle of the night, distant scratching sounds outside my window, the creaking of the old boards in my house. I brushed it off as the sounds of an old place settling, but it was when I found the scratch marks on my door that my unease turned to fear. I decided I needed to take action. The next morning, I drove to the local hardware store. It was a modest place, a single-story building with a faded sign hanging above the door that read Joe's Hardware. As I entered, the bell above the door jingled, and a wave of warmth enveloped me. The smell of wood and metal filled the air. I scanned the aisles, searching for a lock that could secure my door. An older man stood behind the counter. He had thinning gray hair and a thick mustache that twitched when he spoke. "Can I help you?" he asked, looking me up and down. "I need a lock for my door," I said, trying to sound as calm as possible. "I think someone has been trying to break in." He frowned, his brow furrowing as he studied me. "You want a lock, huh? For your door?" "Yes," I replied, a bit taken aback by his strange tone. I needed to feel safe. He shook his head, crossing his arms. "You don't understand. We don't sell locks to outsiders." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, outsiders?" "I live here." The man leaned closer, lowering his voice as if someone might overhear. "This town has its rules. You should know that. You can't just lock your door." Confusion washed over me. "Why not?" "I don't understand. I need to feel secure. I have to protect myself." He leaned back against the counter, a hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "You see, the town does not allow outsiders to lock their doors. It's not safe for us if you do that." I felt my heart race. "What does that mean? Are you serious?" He nodded slowly, as if this was common knowledge. We look out for each other here. Locking your door is a sign that you do not trust the community. It makes things complicated. I could feel my anger rising. I came here for help. If I cannot secure my home, I am at risk. How is that fair? He shrugged, his indifference chilling. It's just how things are. You can buy other things, but not a lock. I felt a mix of frustration and fear. I had no idea what I was dealing with. What do you suggest I do then? Just leave my door open? He shrugged again, not offering any solutions. You will have to figure it out. That is your choice. Panic began to set in. I turned to leave, but my mind was racing. I felt trapped in this strange town, surrounded by people who refused to help. I stepped outside, feeling the cool air hit my face. I had to find a way to protect myself. I decided I would drive to the next town over and find a hardware store there. As I got back into my car, I could still see the store owner watching me through the window. I quickly drove away, my mind filled with the unsettling thoughts of what had happened. I could not shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. After a short drive, I reached the next town. The hardware store was larger, with a bright sign and a more welcoming atmosphere. I stepped inside and immediately felt a wave of relief. The store was busy, filled with customers and a friendly atmosphere. I approached a woman behind the counter, her smile warm and inviting. I need a lock for my door, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Of course, she replied enthusiastically. We have plenty of options. What kind do you need? I quickly explained my situation, and she nodded in understanding. That is awful. You deserve to feel safe in your own home. Let's find you a lock that will work well for you. As she showed me different options, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. After making my choice, I purchased a lock and some tools to install it. I thanked her profusely, feeling grateful to have found someone willing to help. On the way back to my cabin, I could not shake the feeling of unease that lingered from my encounter at Joe's Hardware. I knew I needed to install the lock as soon as I got home. Once I arrived, I gathered my tools and set to work. My hands were shaky, but I focused on the task, hoping the new lock would bring me some sense of safety. After some time, I finally finished. The lock clicked into place with a satisfying sound, and I took a deep breath, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. That night, I felt a sense of security that had been absent for so long. I locked the door and settled in for the evening, determined to enjoy the peace and quiet of my cabin. However, as I lay in bed, I still felt a nagging anxiety in the back of my mind. The incident at the hardware store replayed in my head. The way the owner spoke about the town and its rules haunted me. I could not shake the feeling that I was not safe, that I was somehow being watched. The hours passed slowly, and as midnight approached, I heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, a low rustling sound, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. My heart raced, and I lay still, straining to listen. The sound stopped, but my nerves were on edge. I waited, hoping it was just my imagination. Then, I heard a loud thud against my door. My heart dropped, and I sat up in bed, my breath caught in my throat. The noise echoed in the quiet of the night, and I could feel the adrenaline coursing through me. I reached for my phone, ready to call for help, but my hands were trembling. Who's there? I called out, my voice shaky. No answer came, just the quiet of the woods. Another thud, louder this time, made me jump. I grabbed a flashlight from the table and crept toward the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, trying to listen. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. I could hear faint whispers, but I could not make out the words. It felt as if someone was outside, just waiting. I took a deep breath and turned the flashlight on, shining it through the peephole. The beam of light illuminated the porch, but there was no one there. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. I wanted to call for help, but I remembered that there was no one nearby. I was alone. After what felt like an eternity, the noises stopped. I backed away from the door, feeling a mixture of fear and anger. I had a lock now. I had taken steps to protect myself. But what if it was not enough? Hours passed in silence, and eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I awoke with the sun streaming through the window. I felt exhausted but relieved to have made it through the night. I decided to drive back to the hardware store in the small town to confront the owner. I needed answers. I gathered my things and left the cabin, determination fueling my steps. The drive back felt longer than it should have, and my heart raced as I approached Joe's Hardware. When I walked through the door, the bell jingled, and the familiar smell of wood hit me again. The owner was behind the counter, his face unreadable. "Back for more?" he asked, his tone dripping with disdain. "I need to talk to you," I said firmly. "What you said yesterday was unacceptable." He looked me up and down, his expression unimpressed. "Did you find what you were looking for?" "I did, but that does not change the fact that you refused to sell me a lock. You put me in danger." His demeanor shifted slightly, a glint of amusement in his eyes. "Danger? In this town? You are safe as long as you play by the rules." "What rules?" I pressed. "You expect me to just leave my door unlocked?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "You should understand that locking your door changes things. It invites trouble." I felt the anger boiling within me. I have a right to feel safe. You cannot just dictate how I live. He shrugged, dismissing my words. "You are not one of us. You do not belong here." In that moment, I realized that he was not going to give me the answers I needed. This town was not going to accept me, and there was nothing I could do about it. I felt a wave of frustration wash over me. I turned to leave, feeling defeated. As I stepped outside, I glanced back at the store, the feeling of being trapped settling heavily in my chest. I would not allow them to control me any longer. Back at my car, I took a deep breath, reminding myself of my choice to lock my door. I had a lock, and I was going to use it. I had to look out for myself, regardless of what anyone else thought. I drove away from that town, feeling a mixture of fear and relief. I would find another place, a town that accepted me. As I left, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The town faded into the distance, but I could still feel the weight of their gaze on my back. That lock was a small symbol of my determination to keep myself safe, and I would never let anyone take that away from me again. I had planned this weekend retreat to a small town for some peace and quiet. I rented a small cabin near the edge of a park, a place surrounded by trees and a gentle stream. It seemed perfect for some solitude, a break from the city. The first day, I explored the park. It was quiet, with only the rustling leaves and the chirping birds breaking the silence. I noticed a group of locals gathered near the playground, laughing and playing games. They seemed to be having a good time. I observed them from a distance, feeling a strange pull to join in. On the second day, I decided to be brave. I walked over to the group. They were tossing a ball back and forth, and the atmosphere felt light. I approached them with a smile, trying to blend in. "Hey, mind if I join you?" I asked, hoping they would welcome me. They looked at me, and for a moment there was silence. A tall man with a broad build stepped forward. He had a strong jaw and an unsettling stare. "What do you want?" he asked. I felt a chill run down my spine. I just thought it looked like fun. "I'm new in town." "New, huh?" Another member of the group, a woman with wild hair, sneered. "We don't take kindly to outsiders here." I chuckled nervously, thinking it was a joke. "I'm just here for the weekend. I won't cause any trouble." "Trouble?" the tall man said, his voice low and serious. "You don't belong here. We don't want you here." "Come on, I'm just trying to have some fun," I said, my heart racing as I tried to laugh it off. They exchanged glances, their expressions turning dark. "You should leave," the woman said sharply. "Now." My instinct told me to walk away, but I didn't want to seem weak. I hesitated, trying to figure out what to say. "I'm just playing a game. I don't mean any harm." The man stepped closer, invading my personal space. "You don't understand. This is our place. You are not welcome." I felt the atmosphere shift. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a tension that made my stomach knot. "I'm just visiting," I insisted. "I'll leave in a couple of days." The group began to close in around me. "You need to go," the man said, his voice cold. "If you don't leave, we will make you regret it." Panic washed over me, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I took a step back, trying to create space between us. Okay, I'll go. Right now," the woman snapped. I turned to leave, my mind racing. I could hear their whispers behind me, low and threatening. I hurried away from the park, glancing back to see them watching me, their expressions filled with disdain. I made my way back to the cabin, feeling the weight of their stares on my back. I locked the door behind me, my heart still racing. I tried to convince myself that I had overreacted, that I had misread the situation. But as night fell, I could not shake the feeling of dread. The next morning, I decided I would not return to the park. I would pack my things and leave. I had no intention of getting involved with those people again. As I packed, I could hear the sounds of the town waking up outside, cars driving by, people chatting, but the thought of the group from the park lingered in my mind. I left the cabin and started my car, but the engine sputtered. I turned the key again, frustration mounting as it refused to start. After several attempts, I gave up. I stepped out of the car, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over me. I needed help. I remembered seeing a small diner down the road. I decided to walk there, hoping someone could help me with my car. As I walked, I felt uneasy. The sun was shining, but the warmth did little to calm my nerves. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. When I reached the diner, I opened the door and stepped inside. The atmosphere was friendly, with the smell of fresh coffee wafting through the air. A few patrons looked up from their meals, but I didn't see anyone I recognized. I approached the counter, and a waitress smiled at me. "Can I get you something?" she asked, her voice cheerful. "I need help with my car." "It won't start," I said, feeling a wave of relief. "Is there anyone who could take a look at it?" The waitress frowned. "Oh, I'm not sure. Most of the locals are busy with their own things." Just then, I heard the door swing open behind me. I turned, and my heart sank as I saw the tall man from the park step inside. He scanned the diner, and when he spotted me, his eyes narrowed. He walked toward me, and the atmosphere shifted immediately. "Look who it is," he said, his tone dripping with malice. "Thought you could run away, did you?" The waitress looked between us, confusion spreading across her face. "Is everything okay here?" "Stay out of this," the man growled, his voice low and threatening. I took a step back, feeling the tension rise in the room. "I just want to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Not so fast," he replied, moving closer. "You need to learn your place." Before I could react, he reached for me, and I instinctively pushed back, knocking over a chair in my panic. The diner fell silent, all eyes on us. The waitress looked frightened, but she didn't move. "Leave me alone," I shouted, my heart racing. "Enough." The waitress finally stepped between us. "You can't do this here. Leave him alone." The man hesitated, his expression darkening. "You don't know what you are doing," he said, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Get out, or I will call the sheriff," the waitress insisted, her voice steady. The man glared at her, then back at me. "You are lucky. This isn't over." With that, he turned and stormed out of the diner. I stood there, trembling. The waitress turned to me, concern etched on her face. "Are you okay?" I nodded, though I felt anything but. "I just need to get out of here." "Let me help you," she said, her tone softening. "I can call someone to look at your car. It is better to stay here for now." I agreed, grateful for her kindness. She made the call while I sat at the counter, my mind racing. I could feel the eyes of the other patrons on me, but I tried to focus on the waitress's reassuring presence. When the mechanic arrived, I felt a wave of relief. He assessed my car quickly and told me it was a simple fix. I watched him work, thankful to be away from that man and his threats. After a short while, my car was up and running. I thanked the waitress and the mechanic profusely, feeling a mixture of gratitude and lingering fear. As I drove away from the diner, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the tall man behind me. But there was nothing, just the quiet road stretching ahead. I left the town, feeling both shaken and relieved. I knew I had made the right choice to leave. That group in the park was dangerous, and I would never forget the way they had looked at me. I would find another place to retreat, somewhere I could feel safe. As I drove, I promised myself I would never return to that town again. The thought of those locals and their aggression haunted me, but I was determined to move forward and find peace elsewhere. I decided to visit a small-town farmer's market one sunny Saturday. I had heard good things about it, how the locals made the best homemade goods and how friendly everyone was. The drive there was pleasant, the road lined with tall trees and fields bursting with color. When I arrived, the market was bustling with life. Stalls filled with fresh produce, flowers, and handmade crafts greeted me. I could smell the sweet scent of baked goods drifting through the air. As I wandered through the rows of tables, I came across a vendor selling pies. The woman behind the table, an older lady with silver hair and bright blue eyes, had a warm smile. "Would you like to try a slice?" she asked, her voice cheerful. I nodded and accepted a small piece. It was delicious, sweet and rich with flavors I couldn't quite place. I decided to buy a whole pie. The lady wrapped it up for me and thanked me as I handed her the cash. "Make sure you enjoy it," she said, a glint in her eye that made me pause for just a moment, but I shook it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. I thanked her again and walked away, pie in hand, feeling pleased with my purchase. As I found a bench near the market, I sat down to enjoy a slice. I took my first bite, the flaky crust melting in my mouth. I savored it, but as I did, I started to feel uneasy. It was strange, as if a weight settled in my stomach. I noticed people around me staring. They whispered to one another, glancing in my direction. I brushed it off at first, thinking maybe they were just curious about the newcomer. But then I caught a few words here and there. She shouldn't be here. They will not let her leave. My heart raced. Was there something about this pie I didn't know? I wiped my mouth, feeling suddenly dizzy. The world around me began to tilt, and I put a hand on the bench to steady myself. I took another bite of the pie, but it tasted different now, sour and wrong. I swallowed hard, feeling nausea rise in my throat. I looked around again, and the townsfolk were still watching, their expressions serious, their eyes full of something I could not identify. Panic surged through me. I realized they were not just watching. They were waiting. I stood up abruptly, but my legs felt like jelly. I had to get out of there. "Are you okay?" a woman asked, stepping closer, her tone sweet yet insincere. "I need to go," I stammered, trying to push past her. I felt unsteady, the ground shifting beneath me. The woman grabbed my arm, holding me in place. "You shouldn't be in a hurry. Stay with us. The pie is best enjoyed here." Her grip tightened, and I felt my heart pound in my chest. "Let go of me," I shouted, struggling to free myself. But others were closing in, blocking my path. "She needs to stay," another man said, his voice low and firm. "You are part of the community now." The weight in my stomach grew heavier. I felt the pie pushing back, threatening to come up. I managed to break the woman's grip, stumbling back. I glanced at the exit of the market, but a few people stood there, watching, preventing my escape. "Please," I begged, my voice shaking. "I just want to leave." A chuckle rippled through the crowd. "You are not allowed to leave," the tall man from before said, stepping forward. "You ate the pie. You have accepted our welcome." My mind raced. They had poisoned me. I was sick from their food, and they did not intend to let me go. I looked for a way out, desperate. I had to act fast. I spotted a narrow path between two stalls. It was a chance. I bolted toward it, adrenaline surging. They shouted, but I pushed through, my heart pounding in my ears. The path led me away from the market, and I could hear their voices behind me, growing fainter. I did not stop. I ran until I reached my car, fumbling for my keys. I was shaking, my hands clammy. I got in, locked the doors, and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I pulled out of that town faster than I had ever driven in my life. I could not look back. As I drove, my stomach twisted painfully. I knew I had to get away from that place. The pie had been a trap, and I barely escaped their grasp. I drove until the town was just a memory in my rearview mirror, and only then did I allow myself to breathe again. I had learned a hard lesson that day. Not all towns were welcoming, and sometimes kindness masked something much darker. I promised myself I would never return, never let myself be caught off guard again. I had always been proud to be the mayor of our small town. I loved the sense of community, the way everyone knew each other. We looked out for one another. Or at least, I thought we did. It was a quiet town, a place where crime hardly ever touched us. That is, until a few months ago when I started noticing things that didn't sit right. It began subtly. I would catch glimpses of a group of young men loitering outside the local diner, their faces shadowed by their hoods. They seemed to watch me every time I passed. I thought maybe they were just bored kids, looking for something to do. I mentioned it to the police chief, but he just shrugged it off, telling me to not worry. "You are the mayor. People will always look, he said with a chuckle. But it felt different. Their eyes seemed cold, empty, almost predatory. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was my imagination. The weeks went by, and I started to get phone calls at odd hours. Harassing calls. They would hang up before I could even say anything. It felt like they were testing me, seeing how far they could go. I started to get uneasy, but I didn't want to seem weak. I had a job to do. One night, after a late town meeting, I left the building and walked to my car parked in the lot. It was dark, and the only light came from a flickering street lamp nearby. The parking lot was empty, and I had that unsettling feeling that someone was watching me. I got into my car, locked the doors, and turned the ignition. As I looked into the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement behind me. My heart raced as I glanced back, but nothing was there. I told myself it was just shadows playing tricks. I drove home, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The next day, I received an anonymous letter slipped under my office door. The note was short and menacing. "Stay out of our way." I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew I had to do something, but what could I do? The police were not taking me seriously, and I didn't want to cause a panic. I was supposed to be the leader, the one who kept everyone safe. A few days later, I decided to go for a walk in the park, hoping the fresh air would clear my mind. As I strolled along the path, I saw them again. The same group of young men, laughing and talking, hanging out by the swings. They turned their heads as I approached, their laughter fading. I picked up my pace, trying to ignore the way they stared. Then, without warning, one of them stepped forward. "Hey, Mayor," he called out. The way he said it made my skin crawl. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound calm, though my voice trembled. "Just wanted to talk," he said, a smirk on his face. "You think you can run this town forever? We don't need you here." I took a step back, realizing they were blocking my path. "I think you should leave me alone," I replied, my heart racing. The moment I turned to walk away, they laughed, and I knew I had made a mistake. One of them lunged at me. I stumbled back, but he caught me, pushing me hard. I fell to the ground, the breath knocked out of me. I tried to scramble to my feet, but before I could, they surrounded me. They shouted insults, each word cutting deeper than the last. I felt their fists land on me, each hit blurring my vision, pain shooting through my body. I fought back instinctively, swinging my arms, but I was outnumbered. I could hear their laughter, that horrible laughter that echoed in my ears. "Let's teach the mayor a lesson," one of them shouted. Just as I thought it might be the end, I heard a voice shout from behind them. "Hey! Get away from him." It was an older man, a local shop owner I recognized. The gang turned their heads, momentarily distracted, and I seized the opportunity to push myself up. I ran as fast as I could, adrenaline coursing through me, not looking back. I could hear their angry shouts following me, but I didn't stop until I reached my car. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking. I drove away, my heart pounding in my chest. I could still feel the sting of their punches and the humiliation of being beaten down. For days after, I stayed inside my home, terrified to go out, haunted by what had happened. I reported the incident to the police again, but I felt like I was shouting into the void. I was the mayor, and yet I felt powerless. Eventually, I decided I could not let them win. I started going out again, determined to show that I was not afraid. I attended town meetings, hosted events, and slowly, I began to regain my confidence. But I did not forget those boys. I saw them every now and then, lurking in the shadows, their eyes cold and watchful. I kept my distance, making sure to avoid places where I might run into them alone. One evening, as I was leaving the diner after dinner, I saw them across the street. They were laughing, but I could see the intensity in their eyes. They spotted me too. My heart dropped, and I took a deep breath, reminding myself that I was not alone this time. I stepped into the street, facing them head-on, my chin lifted. They paused, surprised, and for a moment, it felt like the world had stopped. I held my ground, refusing to show fear. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice steady. "You do not own this town." Their laughter faded, replaced by a tense silence. Finally, the leader of the gang shrugged, smirking. "You are in over your head, Mayor," he said before they turned and walked away, their figures disappearing into the shadows. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I also knew this wasn't over. I had escaped them before, but I could not let them intimidate me anymore. I would protect my town, and I would make sure they knew they could not control it. I walked away from that street, a little bruised but not broken, determined to reclaim my strength.